live yet, but I'm just going to act like it's the beginning of the stream just in case, because I'm still figuring out OBS. So, welcome. Hello, hello, there we go. Welcome back to the stream. It's me, your pal, Jason Louv. Yes, hello. Today, we are continuing and going deeper into the nether regions. Yes, you heard that right. Deep, deep into the nether regions of Aleister Crowley. So, you don't need to have seen yesterday's stream to enjoy this one. You can watch yesterday's after, because we're going to recap at the end. Well, we're going to recap all throughout. But long story short, I used O3 Pro and Deep Research, which is probably the best extended research thinking model in the AI LLM world right now. And I got it with the mother of all prompts. And believe you me, I went into deep territory, giving it references on Crowley, letters, biographies, his own personal writing, his own autobiography, autohagiography, as well as the DSM-V. And what I was looking for there is the best modern overview of what Crowley was actually about. What I mean by that is not just psychoanalyzing Crowley, which we are going to do from a Jungian, Freudian, and even Reichian perspective, despite my hesitations about Reich, but more like a psychological profile. And this beast of an AI gave me a 70-page clinical diagnostic, which is as if it was written by a team of the best psychologists in the world. It is phenomenal. And I asked it to analyze him as a human being and figure out what was going on with Aleister Crowley. So we read half of it. Yesterday was 3-hour stream. Today will probably be similar, just fair warning. We read half of the 70-page report yesterday, and we're going to read the second half today. So don't worry. You don't need the first one for context. It's going to be clear right away. We're starting off strong with looking at what role magic itself and spirituality played in Crowley's psychology. Was magic real for him? Was he actually up to something, or was it just a psychological cope? Was it a trauma response? We're going to find out. So, before we get to that, of course, if you're going to do one thing to support this stream, please subscribe. Please subscribe. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button now. And while you're doing that, a couple orders of business. First of all, don't worry, I will not make disgusting mouth noises on this stream. Yes, I saw all the comments yesterday. It was embarrassing, but thank you for commenting so that I don't continue to do that. I'm used to podcasting where you can run essentially noise correction after the fact. So I'm going to have to do some of this, hopefully without touching the mic. So don't worry about that. I have heard you loud and clear. Also, I missed some super chats yesterday, and I'm going to, true to my word, I'm going to catch up on that right away. For some reason, I always miss Occultology, who's great. I miss his super chats for some reason. God knows. So he asks, and P.S., please, there's going to be, this chat went so crazy in the last one that it basically overran and removed a bunch of the earlier super chats. So make sure that you get your super chats in. We're now going to have a new system where our lovely moderator Temple Gold, who is also the moderator of the Discord and the new philosophy channel on the Discord, is going to screenshot all of the super chats so that I make sure that I answer them and that YouTube doesn't deny me and take them from me. So Occultology's question is, my super chat was, imagine if Crowley did DMT, but I would like to know if you have ever worked with spirits from Theurgia Goetia. When I asked Lon, he said he hasn't. Okay, great question. Two questions. As far as the Theurgia Goetia, I believe that's the one with 36. That is more about directional or almost elemental spirits, and it has a circular pattern organizing them of, I think, 36 deacons or something like that. I have not. I've looked at it quite a bit. I have a spreadsheet that I've assembled of it. I've worked with Goetia, which I don't recommend. I've worked with the Ars Pauline, which I definitely recommend, although it doesn't really have clear instructions. You have to kind of figure it out yourself. And I have not worked with the Theurgia Goetia, but if you have, I would love to hear about it. And if anyone else has, I would also love to hear about it. Make sure that you join the Discord where you can talk about all this. I'm going to put up can I put up text? Okay, let's put up text of the Discord, because the Discord is out of control. It's back. It is back. We have expanded it, and let me go find an invite. We have expanded it greatly. We're adding all these new channels. Today we added channels for discussing video games, tabletop role-playing, comics. Also in the Magick chat, we added a channel for philosophy, a channel for yoga, for martial arts, even one for neurolinguistic programming. And recently we've added channels on AI, on tech, and it is out of hand. Today we were discussing Metal Gear Solid 5, and people wanted me to make images of myself as Kazuhara Miller from MGS5, which I have done, and they are hilarious. So you can see those only if you join the Discord. So let me put up that text real quick. Text, free type 2, yes, okay. There we have it. What? I'm going to leave this down at the bottom of the screen for a little bit so that you can enter it while we talk. All right. In terms of the second part of your question, so please join the Discord, everyone. It is out of hand. So in terms of the second part of your question, Crowley doing DMT, what would that be like? Interesting question. I'm sure that he would become fascinated with it. As far as we know, Crowley, we dug into Crowley's drug use extensively in the last one. Crowley's drugs of choice were, he didn't even have LSD, so he used mescaline and peyote quite a bit, which I've never tried. So I don't know what the potential negative or distorting effects of that might be. I was offered it once, but I was told it was a 24-hour trip and I had to get on a plane. I would have had to get on a plane immediately afterwards, and even I wasn't that nuts as a young chaos magician. I'm sure he would have been convinced that he'd met Iwas or something like that, and he, of course, probably would have binged it to the ends of the earth. But fascinating question. Something else potentially to ask AI. All right. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure that you join the Discord. Consider becoming a supporter of the channel. In the next few days, we're going to be adding extra supporter tiers, which you will get extra flair on the Discord. And if anyone else has any other ideas of things you would like to be rewards for supporting the channel on the Discord or otherwise, we're all ears. I'm kind of interacting all day long on the Discord at the moment while I work on the next steps with Magick.me. Okay, so with that said, it's time to dig into the second half of our analysis of Aleister Crowley. So some footnotes from last time. See that? I'm leaning away from the mic. Some footnotes from last time. Without going into the details, the general diagnostic that AI gave, and it's very concise and compelling, is narcissistic personality disorder, along with antisocial disorders, potential comorbidity with bipolar, no schizophrenia, but NPD, and a phenomenally high score on the psychopathy index, 38 out of 40 on the Hare Psychopathy Index, which is, well, let's be glad he's dead so that we don't have to deal with him. And can admire his genius at a far, far distance without getting wrapped up in the utter mess that was Crowley's life and his complete inability to not just hold a job. I don't think he ever had a job in his entire life. He was not able to maintain social contacts with people. He was a messed up puppy, and we determined that a lot of it had to do with his abuse. Quite a lot of it had to do with just like everyone, early childhood trauma. In this case, the loss of his father, his abuse at the hands of the evangelical brethren. He was raised in a extremely crazy right-wing Christian cult, the Plymouth Brethren, who are kind of the source of the DNA of the most crazy evangelicals in America, by the way. And also he was sexually assaulted by a tutor as a teenager, which is not commonly talked about with Crowley, but that very likely had a lot to do with his later psychology, quite a lot. There's one thing I want to, now as a humorous aside before we jump back into it. I have a new theory of the occult and what's actually going on. Oh, occultology says that he has worked with Theurgia Goetia. Fascinating. Ars Goetia, very funny. Fascinating. I would love to hear about it on the Discord. I've never met anyone who's worked with it outside of, I think, David Jones. And I haven't talked to him about it. So, and I actually haven't met him in person. So here's my new theory of the occult. Philip K. Dick wrote a great book called Clans of the Alphane Moon, which is a satire, but it's a science fiction story where the moon is colonized as an insane asylum or a mental health facility. And people with mental illnesses from Earth are sent to the moon. Now, what happens is they form into competing clans. So you've got like the bipolars, the schizophrenics, and they each have their own kind of kingdom and they war with each other. This is hilarious. It's a way to demonstrate what we're learning more and more about as modern people, which is that people have different brains, neurodiversity. I have become convinced that in addition, particularly in the 21st century, we have these old concepts of tribal identity, national identity, state identity as group identities. Now I think it's neurology. It's neurology and, of course, interest on the internet. People are forming interest groups or perhaps in the future almost quasi-states. Magick.me will be the first. Quasi-states of people with similar mentality. And, you know, everyone that I talk to, either here on the Discord, I feel that I immediately have something in common with, and it's like we can talk about all kinds of stuff. And that's not an experience that I have with the normies, and I'm sure it's not with you. That's another reason why the Discord is so important, so that we can actually get some community. Because everybody into this subject, even if they're super famous, by the way, tends to be isolated. Even the most famous and well-known magicians tend to not know anyone else in real life that practices. So community is something that people really want, and they've told me that over and over again. We're providing it here in real time and on the Discord. So here's my theory of the occult. I think there's three groups, there's three neurological tribes in the occult. This is important information. Primarily, and this is probably almost everyone, are people on the autistic spectrum who are fascinated with their special interest, pattern matching, introversion, going into their own internal world, often because of a lack of social skills or inability to overlap with the normal world. These people tend to almost invariably be very sweet, very genuine, and very wonderful people. Not to generalize, not always true. Then we have schizophrenics, and schizophrenics tend to, unfortunately, can often be incredibly brilliant and creative, but often can't control the visions and pattern matching that they're seeing. But they also make up a group within the occult. Now, as long as some psychopathy is not present, or as long as there's no comorbidities, neither of these groups tends to be a danger. Sometimes schizophrenics, unfortunately, can be a danger to themselves. However, there is a third group in the occult, people with narcissistic personality disorder. And these are the ones you get who are the psychotic abusive gurus, who make short work of the introverted autists and the confused schizophrenics. I read, and I can't find it again, but I swear, I read a study a couple months ago, or maybe longer, that quite compellingly said that people with narcissistic personality disorder, which is kind of like bipolar on crack, David Jones passed. I'm sorry to hear that. I did not know that. Rest in peace, to Frater Spartacus. That's very sad. I wish I'd been able to meet him. I had a chance, but I didn't take it. Well, David R. Jones is one of the great Enochian magicians of the 20th century. Thank you for letting me know. So the NPDs, people with narcissistic personality disorder, when they flip into their, they do their bipolar flip, often conceptualize that other side of themselves as the devil, as Satan, or as demonic. And quite often, and I've witnessed this many times with NPD people, as a type of apomorphism, tend to associate themselves or cover themselves sometimes with satanic symbols or imagery, essentially as a warning, whether conscious or unconscious, to other people, that that's what they're going to get if they interact with that person. Now, I don't know about you, but I've interacted with multiple NPD occultists, and they can really fuck your life right up. They are charismatic, they are charming, and they can snap and become psychotic very easily. Again, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm giving you general guidelines here, but something to think about. If you think of the occult as a big aquarium, and it's mostly normal fish, or normal, peaceful, shall we say, not normal, but you got a few piranhas in there. And NPD or bipolar people, they're not necessarily evil or anything like that, but particularly if they have, proper medication and treatment, which everyone should seek out if they have such issues. But when they are untreated and self-medicate, particularly with alcohol and drugs, like our boy here, yeah, they can fuck your life right up. And they have a way of taking control, grabbing the steering wheel from more introverted people, autists and schizophrenics, and just normal people. So neurological normies. So keep an eye out for that, and think about that as we go forward with Crowley. Crowley, of course, genius, one of the smartest people of the 20th century. That doesn't absolve him of his personal issues. Neither does his self-claimed prophet status, right? If we're holding Muhammad's feet to the fire, we sure as hell can hold Crowley's feet to the fire. All right. Let's get into it. Spiritual, mystical frameworks and the role of magic. So, P.S., this was assembled by AI. Somebody who will not be mentioned was going off about it in the comments and then was making thinly veiled threats. They have been removed from this chat, from the Discord, and from Magick.me, so they can cope and seethe. Don't do that. I will come down on you like a bag of bricks. But books we have cited are Crowley's Own Magic in Theory and Practice and Confessions of Aleister Crowley. Israel Regardie's The Eye in the Triangle. Regardie was a trained therapist and did spend time with Crowley in person, which is very valuable. Richard Kaczynski's Perturabo. John Simmons' The Great Beast, The Life of Aleister Crowley. Lawrence Sutin's Do What Thou Wilt. Probably the weakest Crowley biography, but it's in there. The DSM-V. Diary of a Drug Fiend by Crowley. Colin Wilson, Aleister Crowley, Nature of the Beast. Several texts on Jungian and Freudian theory. Christopher Partridge's excellent academic article, Aleister Crowley on Drugs, published by the International Journey for Study of New Religions in 2018. Crowley's own essay, Psychology of Hashish, and many, many other books. Let's see. Colin Wilson, Phenomenology of Excess for NPD and Psychopathy. Regardie's Eye in the Triangle. More John Simons. More Kaczynski. Lots and lots and lots of stuff, along with lots of Crowley's own letters. Okay, so I'm going to get into it. Go ahead. I'm going to break here and there to answer questions. So if you want to make sure your question gets answered, super chat. It's a great way to help the channel and make sure that I can continue doing these. All right. Spiritual, mystical frameworks and the role of magic in Aleister Crowley's life. Aleister Crowley's life mission was defined by magic, which he defined as the science and art of causing change in conformity with will. His spiritual mystical framework was complex, syncretic, and deeply personal. In this section, we examine Crowley's obsession with magic and mysticism from a psychological angle. Was his spiritual quest an expression of genuine transcendence, or was it largely a psychological compensation for trauma and powerlessness? How did practicing magic affect his psyche? Did it integrate or fragment him further? We will discuss key elements of his spiritual path, Thelema's revelation, ceremonial rituals, yoga, identification as a divine prophet, and evaluate their psychological function and dysfunction. Thelema and prophetic identity. The reception of the Book of the Law in 1904 is the cornerstone of Crowley's spiritual framework. Psychologically, this event can be interpreted in a few ways. On one level, it can be seen as a classical mystical experience. Crowley enters a trance state with preparatory rituals and the help of Rose Kelly's spontaneous mediumship, and perceives communication from a higher entity, Aiwass. The content of the revelation, proclaiming a new aeon and Crowley as its prophet, certainly fed his narcissism. But the manner in which it arrived was, by his account, unsought and even unwelcome initially. He famously ignored the text for 5 years. This suggests there was a compelling numinous quality to it beyond his conscious ego's manufacture. Jung might call this an eruption of the collective unconscious, with Aiwass as an archetypal figure, perhaps his own higher self or a logos archetype, speaking through him. Some scholars have noted parallels between Liber Al and earlier literature Crowley knew, raising the possibility that Aiwass was a cryptomnesia. That's interesting. I've never heard that word, cryptomnesia, or secondary personality that synthesized knowledge Crowley had. Indeed, parts of Liber Al echo Crowley's earlier writings. If so, the event might resemble an internal monologue mistaken or taken as external, a phenomenon not uncommon in intense creative or trance states. From a psychoanalytic view, the Book of the Law can be seen as Crowley's id speaking in scripture form after years of superego repression being cast off. It glorifies strength, freedom of desire, and rejects sympathy for the weak, essentially enshrining his adolescent rebellious ethos as divine law. In that sense, it was a profound rationalization of his personal inclinations, elevated to cosmic importance. Here's where pathology and genius entwine. Crowley's revelation was psychologically tailor-made to justify his desires: sexual liberty, pursuit of power, egotism, and to scorn what he hated: Christian meekness, herd morality. It gave him a permanent sense of grand purpose that could shield him from doubts or guilt. Whenever he might question himself, he could fall back on, quote, "the book says so." This could be seen as a delusional system. He believed a praeter-human intelligence gave him a mandate. That belief persisted lifelong, even when evidence didn't align, like humanity not immediately embracing Thelema. He rationalized it rather than abandon the belief. Clinically, one might label that a fixed delusion of grandiosity if evaluating purely by DSM criteria. But there is a fine line. Many religious figures have comparable convictions. The context matters in labeling it pathology versus charisma. Crowley was high-functioning in many areas while holding this belief, which suggests it was a contained delusional belief that did not pervasively impair reality testing except in religious context. Ceremonial magic is psychodrama. Crowley's ceremonial practices, learned from Golden Dawn and then expanded, can be seen as elaborate psychodramas that externalized internal processes. He often described magic as akin to psychoanalysis or drama. You personify forces, invoke gods or demons, not because they exist out there necessarily, but to awaken corresponding forces in the microcosm, oneself. In one commentary, he asks rhetorically the cause of my illusion of seeing a spirit in the triangle of the art, and answers that cause lies in your brain. This is from his 1903 essay, The Initiated Interpretation of Ceremonial Magic, which is published as an introduction to the Goetia. It's a very good early materialist look at magic that he himself would supersede with later thinking, but it's still great. So he was aware that ritual could be understood psychologically. Spirits are subconscious personifications. However, he didn't reduce them to mere psychology. He held the nuanced position that treating them as real is the method to engage those deep layers. That's very interesting. And that perhaps the distinction between internal and external is moot at a certain level. From a mental health perspective, this approach can be double-edged. On the positive side, Crowley's magic provided him a structure for self-exploration and transformation. One could say he was doing a form of self-guided therapy through ritual, confronting fears by evoking demons, striving for higher ideals by invoking gods. For example, when he invoked Thoth or Mercury, he was tapping into his own intellect and wisdom. When he banished demons with pentagrams, he was symbolically banishing internal negative thoughts or influences. This kind of active imagination technique is not unlike Jung's active imagination method, where one dialogues with inner figures. In Magick, Crowley did that, but with full theater, which likely made it more powerful for him. He did report that these practices gave him moments of genuine insight, peace, or resolution, akin to breakthroughs in therapy. However, the negative side is that if one loses the metaphor and starts believing literal supernatural narratives too rigidly, it can reinforce psychosis-like thinking. There were instances where Crowley arguably slid toward magical paranoia, e.g. believing an enemy, like Samuel Mathers or later Dion Fortune, had literally sent etheric vampires to sap his energy. He performed counterspells. This is a tricky call. Within his paradigm, such acts are logical, like one might logically respond to perceived psychic attack. To an outsider, it's delusional. To him, not doing anything would be a failure to defend himself. The result might be relatively harmless, he does a ritual and feels protected, but if he misinterpreted a mundane adversity as an attack and responded with ritual when practical action was needed, that's dysfunction. There's evidence that in a few instances, Crowley resorted to magic when, say, legal or social solutions would have been more effective, arguably sabotaging outcomes. For example, instead of robustly defending himself in the 1934 libel trial with evidence, he might have assumed his talisman or hex on the opposing lawyer was enough. He lost the case. Thus, one could argue his heavy reliance on magic sometimes caused impaired judgment, a kind of faith-based hubris. Yoga and Eastern practices. Integration or escape. Crowley was an adept of Raja Yoga and Pranayama. He could attain deep meditative states, dhyana, and he claimed samadhi. These practices likely had a stabilizing effect on him when done consistently. In his 1901 to 02 period in Ceylon studying under Alan Bennett, he achieved considerable mastery over the mind. That period corresponded with relative equanimity. Much later, in the mid-1930s, Crowley resumed daily yoga and noted improvements in his mood and focus. Yeah, do your yoga. Don't skip your homework. It seems that meditation was one of the healthiest tools he had. Correct. In fact, Crowley, in a way, was much more of a yogi than a magician, and even said so himself at one point. His writing on yoga, to my mind, and I've practiced yoga a long time, Raja Yoga, and studied it in India under Indian gurus and masters, and I still think that Crowley's writing, or Crowley and Bennett's writing on yoga, is probably the most clear ever made. Just phenomenal, and he's to be remembered for anything else. It's that. 8 lectures on yoga, Liber E, Liber Ru, those are phenomenal texts, and I teach from them regularly. So, it seems that meditation was one of the healthiest tools he had. It likely reduced his anxiety, improved impulse control temporarily, and gave a non-drug way to alter consciousness. Rigardi believed that if Crowley had stuck more to meditation and less to sex and drugs, he might have truly redeemed his neuroses. Now, I think it's probably true that he would have gone more in a healthy direction, but meditation alone and yoga are also not enough to heal one's personality. That also needs to be done with therapy. Meditation and yoga can also notoriously be used for spiritual bypassing, and often can make people with psychopathology can worsen their symptoms by allowing them to disassociate and check out into their own grandiosity at times. But that said, it's a wonderful tool that everyone should have in their toolkit, that you should not overlook, you should stick to it. But Crowley struggled with the discipline needed, ironically. When well, he'd do yoga diligently, but in chaos periods, he neglected it. The combination of Eastern mysticism with Western ritual in Crowley's system is often praised as forward-thinking, absolutely. Psychologically, it also balanced two tendencies: the ego-dissolving, quietistic side, yoga, Buddhism influence, and the ego-expressing, dramatic side, ceremonial magic. So I would just call that solve and coagula, like the arms of Baphomet. You dissolve your personality, you reform it. Crowley wrote that one must alternate between these. I agree. Invocation active and meditation passive to avoid imbalance. This is astute. Did he follow his own advice? Sometimes, but not always. One could see that when he was too heavily on the magic side, e.g. performing endless rituals, invoking countless spirits, etc., he edged towards inflation or mania. When he balanced it with meditation retreats, like his Paris, it says Paris Vipassana retreat, but he never called it Vipassana. It says Paris retreat in 1924, or the late life meditations in 1940, he regained some humility and perspective. Just checking one thing real quick. Identification as the Beast 666 and Magus. Crowley's deliberate self-identifications with powerful mythic figures served a psychological purpose of self-empowerment. As discussed in the development section, taking on the beast persona was originally a rebel stance despite his mother and Christian society. But over time, the beast, quote-unquote, became more than adolescent shock value. It became a magical persona, the office of the logos of the new aeon. For Crowley, names held power, well, for all magicians. By naming himself Tomegatherion, the great beast in Greek, he was invoking an archetype of solar phallic power and antinomian authority. In magical theory, assuming a god form can imbue one with those qualities. So every time Crowley referred to himself as 666, or the beast in ritual or writing, he was reinforcing an ego ideal that is invulnerable, cosmically significant. This undoubtedly buttressed him against feelings of inadequacy or loneliness. It also perhaps allowed him to externalize culpability, e.g., if he did something cruel, he could semi-jokingly say, "The beast in me did it. Can you expect the wickedest man to do less?" It gave a narrative shield. There's an excellent essay about this that for some reason you can only find on Wayback Machine. It used to be all over the internet. It was on deoxy.org, if anyone remembers that, called Magusitis, a sheep in Hydra's clothing, a Hydra in sheep's clothing, by one of my great chaos magic teachers. I don't know if she used her real name on that or not, so I won't mention her, but her real name, but Magusitis. Check it out, look it up on the Wayback Machine, search for it. It talks all about this, and it talks about how magicians can identify with archetypes so that they bypass their own fractured personality, and you know, they feel weak, they feel powerless, but you know, Odin can do anything. The great beast can do anything. But they become intoxicated with it, and they never, you know, it's like they never stop playing pretend. With invocation, you're supposed to do that, but only for short periods of time. But when it becomes pathological, as in magicitis, somebody literally replaces their broken personality with some type of archetype, whether that's a god form or something else. We can see that happen with Crowley. It often also happens with rock stars. For instance, the fractured Brian Warner becomes replaced with the invincible Marilyn Manson, and we see how that turned out. Yes, Crowley was a Libra, for those asking in the chat. Oh boy. However, living as an archetype has pitfalls. It likely contributed to what modern psych would call disassociation or inflation. The normal human part of him, with fears, ethical scruples, etc., got overridden by the archetypal role. As mentioned, Rigardi and others saw Crowley as playing a part sometimes, unable to drop the mask. That mask was heavy. It demanded continuous outrageous behavior to live up to the legend. This in turn fueled his addictions and relationship problems, as he felt compelled to demonstrate beastliness, excess, at cost to personal well-being. Colin Wilson's observation that abandoning the Messiah mask would have felt like psychological suicide to Crowley near the end rings true. That suggests deep over-identification with the persona. He perhaps lost or never fully developed a private, vulnerable identity that could coexist with the public mage. This is akin to a rock... Here we go, yeah, see, it even says it. This is akin to a rock star who becomes the stage persona 24/7 and spirals out, a phenomenon of identity diffusion under persona pressure. And we've got lots of examples of that. Magic as integration versus fragmentation. A crucial question. Did Crowley's practice ultimately integrate his psyche or further fragment it? One could argue both at different times. In some of his writing, notably Liber ABA, Book 4, and 8 Lectures on Yoga, he demonstrates a lucid, integrated understanding of the self and the universe that is almost sage-like. Well, I'd say it's more than sage-like. He was a genius. These works were written during relatively stable periods. That implies that when Crowley achieved a balance of his magical work, symbolic externalization, and mystic work, internal realization, he found a kind of harmonious flow. His conscious and unconscious aligned towards his true will. Several accounts exist of Crowley radiating a sense of peace or extraordinary focus, especially immediately after significant spiritual attainments, e.g., after his 1908 John St. John retreat. His students found him, that might have been 1909, or maybe that's when it was published. His students found him more mellow and kind for a spell. These could be moments of integration courtesy of magic and mysticism functioning as intended, as pathways to wholeness, or individuation in Jungian terms. Conversely, during other periods, especially when he pushed magic into realms of extreme transgression, and when under substance influence, the practice appears to have fragmented him more. For instance, the Cefalù period, where he was doing intense sex magic with multiple partners, writing the highly dark Book of Lies and others, and that was not during the Cefalù period. I believe that was 1913. Oh, no, excuse me, it was earlier because it was before he was initiated into OTO. So these are two different periods. But it sounds how AI wrote it, it's saying it's one, but these are two specifically different periods. Writing the highly dark Book of Lies and others and pushing boundaries in every way, he descended into a kind of personal hell, arguably losing cohesion. Witness his inability to maintain the Abbey's order or his finances, and his personal diaries turning increasingly curt and chaotic. Curt, I don't know. He was binging on coke, and his diaries just go on, particularly in 1920. One might say that his shadow overtook him in these workings. He summoned Choronzon and chaos and was partially consumed by Choronzonic forces, disintegration, and meaninglessness. Kenneth Grant, a later follower, posited that Crowley went, quote, beyond the abyss and encountered truly alien forces he couldn't fully digest, leading to some degree of spiritual fallout. Psychologically, that might equate to an encounter with the contents of the unconscious that proved overwhelming. We should also consider the Abbey of Thelema's stated goal. It was meant as a utopian integration of daily life with spiritual practice. In theory, this is extremely integrative, bridging sacred and profane. But in practice, the Abbey became a place of unbounded id expression with insufficient structure. Children ran wild and hygiene was neglected. Yes, as I said yesterday, the Abbey of Thelema was a crack house and really shouldn't be seen as anything else. It was just a straight up, shooting gallery meth house that, they weren't on meth, but they were on heroin and cocaine and ether. And it was filthy. It was, people were delusional. They were engaging in all kinds of horrible activities, like attempting to have Leah Hersig have sex with a goat. It was not safe for children. It was, shall we say, a period of time in Crowley's life that can't be excused, as many try to do, as some type of psychological process, like absorbing the mysteries of filth, as he said. It was, now, while that may have been going on in Crowley's mind, the fallout was very real for everyone around him. So while he may have thought he was undergoing some individuation process, and likely was, absorbing the Qliphoth and all of this, the effects were real. And clearly he had psychopathic regard for the people around him, because there was really severe fallout from that. A lot of people had their lives ruined during that period. We should also consider the Abbey of Thelema's stated goal. It was meant as a utopian integration of daily life with spiritual practice. In theory, this is extremely integrative, bridging sacred and profane. But in practice, I already read this, okay, but I'll read it again. The Abbey became a place of unbounded id expression with insufficient structure. Children ran wild, hygiene neglected. The attempt to sacralize everything ironically led to a kind of entropy. Not all members could handle it. One died, Raoul Loveday, and others were left traumatized. This indicates that Crowley's approach lacked the safety rails that, say, traditional ashrams maintain. And it's not like traditional ashrams have it together either, but they're usually not this deranged. Osho's might have been, although that's not exactly traditional. He underestimated the psychological strain of constant transgression and intense ritual without normal restorative routines. Yeah, no aftercare. So rather than integrate, that environment tended to decompensate participants, Crowley included, arguably. Spiritual genius or delusion. Ultimately, was Crowley an enlightened being or a self-deluded megalomaniac? The evidence suggests he had glimpses of genuine spiritual insight. For example, Crowley's description of mystical union in The Heart of the Master and others is deeply congruent with accounts from mystics across cultures. He describes the loss of ego boundaries, unconditional bliss, unity with all. These are not mere rantings. They align with known mystical phenomenology. It's likely Crowley did achieve these states, perhaps through a combination of meditation, ritual exaltation, and even drug catalysis at times. These experiences likely were profoundly meaningful to him and gave him conviction that his path was valid. This is the gnosis side of the coin. He touched the numinous. There's a point I have to make here that can't be made enough, and to his credit, Crowley was very clear on this. Western culture has this bizarre confusion with the attainment of spiritual states and, how do I put it, being a good person. Spiritual and mystical state, let's make this clear right now. Spiritual and mystical states, whatever else they're about, whatever meaning is attached to them, are events that happen in the brain. And the brain is the same, outside of pathologies, with everyone. So you can give a serial killer an experience of oneness, and he will have a spiritual experience, but he's still going to be a serial killer. Maybe he'll have an insight. Maybe he'll have some insight. Maybe it will make him worse. There's a very clear example of this where during the let's talk about LSD, right? Just because it's very easy for people to understand more than yoga and samadhi, which is also a brain change technique. During the MK Ultra trials, many people were dosed with LSD by the CIA. 2 of them became unbelievably psychotic. One was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, right, who was also a genius, but also psychotic with no regard for human life. Another one was Whitey Bulger, the infamous Boston mobster who was incredibly sadistic, who Johnny Depp played in the movie Black Mass. Other examples, Anders Breivik, the mass shooter in Norway that killed 60 kids on an island, used meditation to numb himself from empathy so that he could do so. This was also done by the Japanese kamikaze fighters who used meditation to basically blunt their emotional empathy and turn themselves into weapons. So people need to understand this. Magic, meditation, and mysticism, when you look at them outside of Christian mythology, or rather the inherited Christian presets of Western people, they're just techniques for brain change. This is why these things need to go hand in hand with real work on your personality, therapy, being a normal person, having real friends in the real world, being physically fit, being healthy, all of this stuff. Magic and mysticism are not an escape from reality. They don't absolve you of your responsibilities. They don't absolve you of your need to be a decent person to the people around you and do therapy or work in that regard if you're having difficulties with that. Crowley was very clear on this. In fact, you can really read Crowley almost as a human sigil demonstrating this. He intentionally made himself in many ways this awful, or said that he intentionally made himself this awful, because he was pointing out, like, he wrote about his heroin withdrawals. He wrote about all of his pathological sadism and all of this. He was pointing out that he was acting like a scientist and saying that these things can be observed empirically and induced empirically. And this is critical for humanity to understand and to master this technology so that we can basically master our brains, which will lead to the mastering of all reality. That's true. So that doesn't mean, now, P.S., this does not mean that people are absolved of morality and ethics. Far from it. It's just that the morality and ethical training needs to happen hand in hand with the spiritual training. The spiritual training doesn't do it automatically. And people who think it does are spiritually bypassing. So make sure you eat your vegetables. Spiritual genius or delusion. Ultimately, was Crowley an enlightened being or a self-deluded megalomaniac? The evidence suggests he had glimpses of genuine spiritual insight. For example, Crowley's description... Wait, I already read this. No. Excuse me. So I just read, this is the gnosis sign of the coin. He touched the numinous. However, the other side is that Crowley's ego co-opted those experiences into a narrative of being special. A special snowflake. Yeah. Now, my personal analysis here that I came to at some point is I think that basically what happened with Crowley is he achieved enlightenment states by using Eastern technologies, particularly Buddhism. And because he was so hardwired from, he wasn't allowed to read anything except the Bible, literally. He was in a Christian group that took everything as literal dispensation. Think about the Christian script. Think of it as like a framework. Who is allowed to have magical powers in Christianity? Now, there's some saints, right? Crowley was no saint. But in general, it's either Christ or the Antichrist. And since Crowley had identified with the B666 from early on, and if we want to talk about actual sorcery, that is attributed to the beast in Babylon in the Book of Revelation, dogs and sorcerers, and so on and so forth. I think that his childhood programming was so deep set that the only way that he could reconcile achieving those spiritual states was inflating this persona of, he just basically just decided he was the beast, and it inflated into this magacitis. That's my own personal analysis. Remember, enlightenment does not make you special at all. It's standard. It's something that human beings can and do achieve all over the world all the time, whether it's in this context or not. Yes. However, the other side is that Crowley's ego co-opted those experiences into a narrative of being special, rather than, say, dissolving his ego permanently into humility, as some mystics do after enlightenment experiences, emphasizing compassion and egoless service. That's not necessary either. That's just one way people approach it. Crowley interpreted his experiences as confirming his cosmic importance as a new prophet. In Jungian terms, he succumbed to inflation after contact with the capital S self. It's like Icarus. He touched the sun of transcendent knowledge, but then used it to wax his wings of pride, leading to falls. There's a telling anecdote. Even in his highest claimed grade, Ipsissimus, he would still react pettily to insults. He admitted once in a candid letter, "I'm a bit of an Ipsissimus, but not all the time." This hints he knew his enlightenment was not stable or fully integrated. Well, at the same time, it may... Is that necessary? I think that particularly as magicians become more older and more mature, and they experience more and more of these states, you really have to come to a Buddhist perspective, which is, yeah, you can hit an enlightenment state, absolutely. You can achieve samadhi, nirvikalpa samadhi, and all that. But guess what? You're still in time. You're still in a body. So that is not going to be permanent. You'll touch that state, and you'll come back to baseline, and maybe your baseline is altered, but spiritual progress is more like this, or like a spiral. God is he with a spiral force in the Chaldean oracles. So I don't necessarily think that, people have this idea that spiritual people have to be Jesus, right? Well, what if they're just normal humans who can properly operate their brain? Okay. So, let's see. All right. Role of magic in coping with trauma. We've touched on how magic gave Crowley a sense of control and narrative for his life. It also functioned as a meaning-making system that could transform suffering into, quote, initiatory ordeals. For instance, when things went wrong, he often reframed events as tests from the secret chiefs or the universe to strengthen him. I know I keep interjecting, but that's pretty... I feel that that's actually fairly psychologically healthy. I do that, It's like when you can reframe your life struggles as part of your magical training and initiation, suddenly you have a sense of agency over it. And any psychologist will tell you that having a sense of agency over your life is key to mental health. So you just don't want to go off the deep end delusional. Use maybe logic, like Robert Anton Wilson so wisely told us. For instance, yes. This is it says this is a healthy coping mechanism in moderate form, a kind of positive reappraisal, but potentially dangerous in excess. It could justify not addressing problems realistically. Nonetheless, it likely preserved his mental continuity. Without the belief that his hardships... Thank you, Jacobus, so much. Without the belief that his hardships had occult meaning, he might have succumbed to despair, given how dire his life became in the 30s. That right there is a good ad for magic, frankly. Magic as relationship to self. It really can get you through hard periods. I'll tell you this with no reservation whatsoever. The magic has always been there for me. Always. 24/7. In the worst and hardest parts of my life, magic has been there and shown up for me. And when your back's to the wall, it will always work. It will always be there for you if you engage in it. So this is the fact that he was able to use it to get through hardships. We should consider that in addition to the fact that he caused many of his hardships himself. Magic is relationship to self. Crowley often anthropomorphized aspects of himself as gods, devils, or angels in ritual. Essentially, he externalized internal dialogues. For many creative or highly imaginative individuals, this can stave off true fragmentation by giving each psychological component a voice on the stage. Crowley's diaries sometimes read like dialogues. For instance, something like, did ritual, invoked my holy guardian angel, received instruction, do X, avoid Y. That could just be his inner wisdom or intuition speaking, which he heard by allowing a separate voice. So in a sense, Magick gave him a method to consult and integrate inner guidance, or the HGA, and also to face inner saboteurs, demons, straightforwardly. Evidence of positive change or lack thereof. One yardstick. Did Crowley become a better human being over decades of spiritual practice? It's debatable. Many who knew him in old age described him as gentler than his younger self. He was more accepting of people's foibles and often gave kind advice to younger occultists. He had mellow moments playing chess at the local club in Hastings, where he was remembered as a courteous, if eccentric, old man. This could indicate some maturation, or just age and exhaustion. On the flip side, he could still be manipulative and spiteful even near the end. Yeah, if you want to see how spiteful Crowley got, even toward the end, check out the book The Unknown God by Martin Starr, where he talks about Crowley's interactions with the Los Angeles OTO, and particularly his treatment of Wilfred Smith, who he more or less just straight up did an Eric Cartman on and conspired with the rest of the people in the group from England by mail to convince Wilfred Smith, who was a problem. He was making everything sexual. He was a problem for everyone. But in order to get rid of them, they convinced him to go out into Crowley convinced him that he was a god in human form and that he had to go out into a shack for 6 months to meditate and determine what god this was. It's a utter psychological trap, right? It's just a straight FU. It's an incredibly cruel thing to do to people, to do to somebody. So, it also says this: on the flip side, he could still be manipulative and spiteful even near the end. He, for example, cast off one of his last devotees, Kenneth Grant, over a trivial disagreement. Yeah, by the way, that disagreement was Crowley had got a follower had sent, this is so funny, Kenneth Grant, the great Lovecraftian magus. One of Crowley's followers, I believe, had sent him some really nice cookies from America, and Kenneth Grant, who was 21 at the time, ate them, said he didn't, and then hid the wrappers in between the bed and the wall, and Crowley found it. This was, I think, what ended their relationship. This is just hilarious. Kenneth, come on. Don't take the old man's cookies. So he literally had his hand in the cookie jar. What's the great spiritual significance of that, Kenneth? What's the gematria of that? Which tunnel is that? So, spiritually, it's unclear if he achieved a true moral or character transformation, as some traditions would expect of a, quote, master. Many would say he did not. He died arguably as narcissistic and hedonistic as he lived, albeit tempered by frailty. This raises the notion that maybe Crowley's path lacked an ethic of compassion that other spiritual paths include as a measure of progress. I have a lot to say about that because other spiritual paths can lean so far into that they make the person a slave of basically the group. And one thing that I truly value about Crowley's system is that it is a path of empowering the individual. And you can go too far in that, but often spiritual people really lack boundaries and they get swept away. And Crowley wrote about this quite a bit and completely lose themselves in practices that are possibly taking them away from what they really need to do in life. Without deliberately cultivating empathy or selflessness, which he even mocked as concepts, he may have elevated his consciousness in some technical ways, but left his basic personality traits relatively untouched or even exacerbated, since his system validated his worst impulses as holy at times. We have a much better understanding of this now. It's called spiritual bypassing. Container versus catapult. I mean, this is standard. This things it's talking about Crowley, like I've seen this in so many people. So this is standard for the path, standard pitfalls to watch out for. One of the reasons Crowley is so valuable is not that he can show you what to do, is he can also show you what not to do. Like, for instance, coke and speedballs. Container versus catapult. Did Magick provide a container for integrating Crowley's psyche, or did it accelerate his fragmentation? I'll answer with nuance. In his younger years, Magick was a creative container. It gave him a sense of identity, purpose, and a field to channel his energies that might otherwise have gone into outright criminal or self-destructive acts. You could argue that if he hadn't become an occultist, his sadistic and ultra-libertine urges might have led him into much darker life outcomes, like actual violent crime or insanity. Magick offered a ritualized, symbolic expression, so to that extent, it likely kept him functional for a longer time than otherwise. However, in later years, the very same devotion became an echo chamber that prevented corrective feedback. By insulating everything in magical meaning, he seldom had to confront reality checks like, perhaps I'm wrong, or I need help. And this was exacerbated by basically taking on the guru role and forming the OTO around him. This hindered growth and likely hastened physical decline and social alienation. Followers and occult culture. An external perspective. What impact did his mystical persona have on others? Some disciples, like Rigardi, eventually saw Crowley as mentally unwell in some respects. Rigardi wrote The Eye in the Triangle partly to come to terms with how someone so enlightened in knowledge could be so twisted in behavior, concluding Crowley was neurotic but not insane, with formidable will but tragic flaws. Many occultists influenced by Crowley separated Crowley's brilliant system from his personal failings, which we almost do. The motto, do as I say, not as I do, often applied. This itself suggests that to peers, at least part of Crowley's magic is seen as valid spiritual technology, evidence that the system can stand independent of the man. Yes, indeed. In many ways, I think that one of the valuable things about Crowley being such a mess is that, and I think that he was probably intentionally trying to do this, is that so that you can easily separate the techniques from the man, which is the opposite of what every other prophet has done. They have all set themselves up as the supreme ideal, where Crowley was often saying, don't do what I'm doing. It wasn't always do as I say, not as I, well, it was do as I say, not as I do. But again, he would record, long diary passages about having diarrhea and heroin withdrawal and things like this. So this didn't work with everyone because, of course, so many people just emulate Crowley and his bad behavior. But I think the proper, mature approach to Crowley is to take the work, assess it on your own terms, and understand that, while he's very inspirational, we can learn all kinds of things from him. At the end of the day, Crowley is dead. He died in 1947, and everyone who makes their way in this path must learn it and do it on their own terms. Remember, it's do what thou wilt, not do what Aleister Crowley wilt. Indeed, Thelema continued after him, arguably matured by others, to be less about Crowley's personality and more a general path. In psychological summation, Crowley's mystical and magical endeavors were both a great creative transcendence and a grandiose folly. They illustrate the double-edged nature of esoteric practices. They can elevate consciousness and provide deep meaning, but they can also aggravate narcissistic and schizotypal tendencies if not grounded. Crowley often lacked grounding. He famously admonished to keep one foot in the material world, but in practice, he often floated both feet in the astral, especially when life got hard. Had he more consistently applied his own principle of balance, the middle pillar, so to speak, between severity and mercy, his magic might have integrated him into a wise elder. Instead, he oscillated between prophet and madman modes. And I would also say kind of scheming Eric Cartman mode. In an epitaphic sense, Crowley's spiritual legacy shows that he indeed tapped into genius, creative, syncretic, paradigm-shifting, giving Western culture a new spiritual vocabulary. Yeah, Thelema, true will, etc. But the personal cost he paid and inflicted reminds us that spiritual genius without psychological integration can lead to self-undoing, and not in the good way. He once wrote poignantly, "I'd rather be vaporizing in the absolute than wallowing in the mud of my personal being." This reveals how uncomfortable he was in the mundane human self. He constantly sought the absolute, the mystical, at the expense of the personal. Thus, one might conclude, Crowley's obsession with magic was both his salvation from a world he felt alien in and his damnation, as it divorced him from common humanity. I think Crowley himself would have enthusiastically embraced both. And not seen that as an error. He would have seen it as just experiencing more of life, I think. Genius, intelligence, and creativity. Well, let's go back. We got any super chats? I don't want to lose them. I see Jacobus, $27.99 Canadian dollars. Canuck bucks. Greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. I am very touched by that. Okay. Remember, get your super chats in so that I can make sure to answer your questions. Genius, intelligence, and creativity. Aleister Crowley was undeniably a man of significant intellect and creativity. In this section, we evaluate Crowley's cognitive abilities, creative output, and the notion of genius in his case. We will consider evidence of high intelligence, linguistic talent, strategic thinking, etc., examples of his creativity, poetry, and system building, and also analyze how his cognitive strengths were interwoven with his psychological issues. We will address whether Crowley might be seen as neurodivergent, for instance, exhibiting traits of autism spectrum or other atypical cognitive profiles, and how his intelligence interacted with his ability or inability to manage practical life demands and relationships. Linguistic and literary talent. Crowley was a prodigious writer. He published over 40 books and wrote countless essays, articles, and poems. He had a remarkable command of the English language, able to write in styles ranging from scholarly treatise to lyrical poetry to scathing satirical prose, absolutely. He was also proficient in multiple languages. He read French and German well, knew some Latin and Greek from classical education, and even studied Sanskrit and Chinese to understand sacred texts. Though not fluent conversationally, he engaged deeply with those languages' literature. This indicates a classic profile of verbal intelligence at a very high level. His memory for texts was outstanding. He could quote long passages of poetry or magical cipher alphabets from memory. Biographer Lawrence Sutin notes that Crowley's ability to pastiche different writing styles, e.g., biblical tone in the Book of the Law, Quranic tone in his holy books, Augustan prose in essays, demonstrates not only talent but conscious control. He could think in different registers. As a poet, Crowley's value is debated. Some of his early poetry was derivative of the decadence. For instance, Swinburne and Baudelaire were heavy influences. Critics often panned his poems as bombastic or obscene. He lacked the discipline to refine his verse, often writing too much. However, he did produce some pieces admired for their technical skill, e.g., Hymn to Pan is often cited as powerfully evocative, and even his detractors sometimes concede he had moments of poetic brilliance. From a cognitive standpoint, his poetic output shows divergent thinking, the ability to generate a multitude of ideas, images, and symbols. Crowley had a fertile imagination, one might say to the point of overabundance, which is a hallmark of creative genius, albeit one needing editing. Chess and mathematics. Crowley, as a young man, was a near-champion chess player. At Cambridge, he was on track to become a world-class chess master. He won college matches and seriously considered a professional chess career. Chess prowess indicates strong, logical mathematical intelligence, pattern recognition, strategic planning, memory of openings. Crowley's decision to abandon chess for magic was telling. He said chess would consume him and he wanted his focus elsewhere. But the skills remained. Later in life, he would crush opponents at local chess clubs well into his 60s. This suggests his analytical thinking was keen. I think it was either Grady McMurtry. It was Grady McMurtry, Rigardi, or Kenneth Grant. Or it may have been C.F. Russell, I think, caught Crowley cheating playing chess. at Netherwood. But still, he applied similar analytical rigor to designing rituals and solving magical puzzles like decoding cryptograms in the Book of the Law. He spent years on that. It also appears in his ability to structure complex organizations. AA had a detailed grade system, curriculum, etc., which he largely authored. That administrative planning takes a certain type of intellect. Scientific and experiential curiosity. Crowley considered himself a scientist of the occult, coining the term scientific illuminism, which is great in my opinion. He insisted on recording results of experiments, be it trying a new meditation, invoking a spirit, or taking a drug, carefully. His journals read partly like lab notebooks, noting conditions and results. This empirical attitude is a sign of systematic problem-solving ability and openness to evidence, albeit within the idiosyncratic subject matter of magic. It shows intellectual honesty up to a point. He was willing to tweak rituals if results didn't come, and he recognized when something seemed like a personal illusion. That said, his interpretations of results were always colored by his expected paradigm, i.e., confirmation bias. But a true dullard or insane person wouldn't bother with documentation and revision. Crowley did, including indicating a method to his madness intellectually. Organizational leadership, or lack thereof. Here's where his practical intelligence faltered. While he could conceive grand structures, executing them was another matter. He tried to lead the OTO and his own AA order, but both remained relatively small and often in disarray. He lacked emotional intelligence, EQ, in dealing with followers, often alienating them by expecting absolute devotion and giving little nurture. This suggests a discrepancy. Cognitively high functioning, but interpersonal cognitively, social cognition impaired. That pattern is often seen in individuals on the autism spectrum or with narcissistic personality disorder. Did Crowley have ASD traits? Some have speculated yes. He was extremely focused on his special interest, occultism, had difficulty empathizing with others' emotional states, and could be socially odd, inappropriate remarks and fixations. I'm sure many of you, this sounds very familiar to you. However, there are counterpoints. He was very socially manipulative and aware when he wanted to be. Autistic folks usually do not excel at deception and charm the way Crowley could. This is very true. His social failures seem to come... Autistic people find it very, very hard to lie, if possible at all. His social failures seem to... That's a generalization, but you get the idea. His social failures seem to come not from cluelessness about feelings. He could intuit weaknesses to exploit, which requires some theory of mind, but from disregard for others' feelings. That leans more to narcissistic or antisocial traits rather than autistic lack of understanding. So I'd lean that Crowley was not autistic per se, but an imaginative, non-conventional thinker who sometimes appeared eccentric in ways superficially similar to ASD. Memory and knowledge base. Crowley amassed a vast knowledge in diverse fields: mythology, comparative religion, literature, even art. He tried painting in late life, not very successfully, He also showed ability in cryptography. During World War I, he offered his services to British intelligence in creating or deciphering codes. They didn't really use him, but he had taught himself code techniques. They did use him for lots of other stuff, though, which this does not note. It's quite possible, as Richard Spence has pointed out, that Crowley may have been recruited by MI6 directly out of college and worked for them on and off for much of his life. This is often the case with very bright and intelligent students in the UK. All these speak to a very nimble and capacious mind. If one had given Crowley an IQ test, likely he'd score extremely high in verbal comprehension index, high in perceptual spatial, maybe slightly lower in working memory, only because he disliked rote tasks, but probably still above average, and high in processing speed, if it was a subject of interest, though maybe slower if bored. In anecdotal terms, people noted his quick wit. He could pun in an instant or pull out esoteric references to stump others, the downside being it could turn into pedantry or showing off. Delusions of grandeur versus actual ability. A question arises. How much of Crowley's self-image of genius was warranted? He did call himself the Master Therion, often writing that he surpassed all other poets of his era, etc. Objectively, he was not the greatest poet or mountaineer or scholar of his time, though he was solid in each. But in the occult domain, he arguably was one of the most innovative thinkers of the early 20th century. I would say inarguably. Ahead of his time in synthesizing Eastern and Western thought. His concept of the true will anticipated later humanistic psychology ideas about self-actualization. His understanding of the unconscious, calling it the subconscious or hidden self, and integration through ritual was akin to psychotherapeutic ideas emerging later. These could be considered strokes of genius or at least clever intuition. The problem was his hyperbole. He made it hard for academia or mainstream to appreciate his genuine ideas because he laced them with bombast, like claiming his Book 4 would revolutionize human thought more than Newton or Buddha. A hard sell. Well, we'll see. So yes, he had some delusions of grandeur where he overestimated his place in history, especially earlier on. Interestingly, by the 1940s, he'd realized he'd largely be, quote, a footnote if lucky in mainstream eyes, which embittered him. I see your lovely super chats. Thank you. I will directly answer them in the gap before our next major section. Neurodivergence and bipolarity. Many have posited Crowley had a form of bipolar disorder, which often, in its hypomanic phase, grants surges of creativity and productivity, the so-called fire of genius. Indeed, Crowley's work pattern looks bipolar. Bursts of prolific writing, e.g. 1911-12, when he simultaneously produced Book 4, the Equinox issues, and multiple other pieces. I don't know if Book 4 was then. I think that was later, although he put a lot. He was incredibly prolific in the late aughts, 1900s, and early 1910s. That's probably his best period, in my opinion. That's before the drugs really took hold. This was followed by periods of relative quiet. For instance, 1914 to 18, when he wrote less original stuff, more journalism and propaganda, as if in a down cycle. Friends reported his mood swings. If he was bipolar 2, hypomania plus depressions, that could align. His highs gave visionary experiences and monumental confidence to undertake big projects. His lows corresponded to times he felt lost or addicted or uncreative, like the late 20s after the Abbey fiasco, when he struggled to write much except Diary of a Drug Fiend and some minor works. A manic vulnerability might also explain his tendency to grand, optimistic plans that later collapsed when he wasn't in that manic drive. Bipolar and intelligence often coincide in reports of creative, famous individuals. Many poets and composers had it. If Crowley indeed had an affective disorder, that neurodivergence might have powered the amplitude of his creative energies beyond an average steady state. There is an anecdote. During some writing sessions, he'd sit and type for 12 hours straight, suggestive of a hypomanic focus, then not work for days. I mean, that's my normal working schedule. He could also be superhumanly energetic during ritual series, e.g. he and Neuberg's desert trek was physically and mentally grueling, yet he was energized by it. Conversely, he could spend days in bed during depressions or heroin stupor. Interpersonal versus intellectual intelligence. Crowley's IQ was lopsided. Interpersonally, he often lacked tact or awareness of normal social conventions. For instance, he might insult someone's religion at their own dinner table and not care. When it came to persuading or manipulating in pursuit of his will, he could do it. He lured many into trying his stuff, so he wasn't wholly lacking social skill. In fact, he was friends with many of the most, the leading intellects and literary lights of his time. He could turn on the charm, but he was blind to something crucial: maintaining mutual, trustful relationships. He seemed unable to imagine that others needed respect and care just as he did. This empathy deficit isn't an intellectual flaw per se, but it impeded collaborative endeavors that might have further validated his genius through community building. Hopefully we're working the kinks out here with all of our community building for the magical current, which I'm really enjoying. For example, if he'd kept key allies like the Joneses, Rigardi, etc. in good stead, perhaps Thelema would have grown faster and his organizational dreams realized. Instead, his personal failings overshadowed his brilliance, ironically limiting the spread of his intellectual contributions during his life. Only posthumously, when people separated the work from the man, did his ideas gain more respect in occult circles. Symbolic and abstract thinking. Crowley was extremely adept at symbolic thinking, a reason he took to Kabbalah naturally. He could see connections between disparate systems, e.g., linking Egyptian deities to astrological planets, to Hebrew letters, to psychological states, and construct a coherent narrative. This integrative abstract thinking is a hallmark of a high-concept genius, but also can lead to apophenia, seeing patterns that aren't real. Crowley sometimes indulged in what looked like apophenia, e.g., he took trivial events as cosmic signals, or did complex math on numbers of people's names to conclude fateful things, i.e., number mania. Some could call that a mild thought disorder. Others call it creative free association. It's a continuum. In moderate measure, it allowed him to develop rich correspondences that deepened understanding, e.g., linking tarot, elements, Jungian functions, perhaps, etc., way ahead of Jungians. In extreme, it led to chasing meaningless numerological puzzles. Is this true? It says right here, like he got obsessed that Kek, K-E-K, might be a key to Liber Al, which in retrospect seems a dead-end puzzle he wasted time on. Is that, that can't be true. That cannot be true. It literally says K-E-K. He got obsessed with that Kek might be a key to Liber Al. If anyone can find any evidence that that actually happened, that would be insane. This may be, and I hope that this is an AI hallucination, but if anyone can find any evidence of that or knows about it, man, the Kek might be the key to the Book of the Law. What the? Fucking 4chan sorcerers are retroactively changing reality. Work ethic and output. Often geniuses have periods of incredible work ethic. Crowley, for all his vice, did have a disciplined side instilled perhaps by his father's example. In his 20s, he systematically wrote and published volumes of poetry. In his 30s, he systematically produced a corpus of magical instruction, the 10 numbered equinox issues, and supplementary texts. That needed focus and perseverance. When not derailed by drama or drugs, Crowley could be highly productive and organized. Some diaries show an almost clockwork schedule of meditation, writing, meal, ritual, etc. for weeks on end, akin to a monk. This internal duality, one part of him methodical and brilliant, the other chaotic and self-indulgent, is arguably the tension of his life. If we view his intellectual and creative side as a genius archetype, and his emotional, impulsive side as the demon he wrestled, one might say his life was an ongoing battle between these poles. Sometimes the genius triumphed, leaving us books and systems. Sometimes the demon triumphed, leaving wreckage. All right, the chat's on it, looking about searching the archives for Kek. Let's see. I'm super curious. I hope somebody can find that. You will be known as someone who has opened a portal to God knows what if you find that. And a legend and hero of the chat. ASD consideration revisited. One reason people guess autism is his lack of filter, singular obsession, and difficulty relating to peers. Another angle, he didn't easily learn from social punishment, e.g. being ridiculed in the press didn't make him change approach. Well, to his credit, I would say. He often doubled down or ignored it, which could be seen as thick-skinned and mission-focused, a positive spin, or as oblivious, a negative spin. Autistic individuals sometimes disregard social feedback because it doesn't register the same. Narcissists disregard it because they devalue the source. Crowley likely was the latter. He definitely devalued critics, e.g. calling anyone who didn't praise him stupid or slave-minded. That's less lack of comprehension and more protective arrogance. Contribution to knowledge. Historically, Crowley's intellectual legacy includes pioneering cross-cultural religious studies. He was reading Eastern scriptures before it was common in the West. Proposing a link between magic and psychology, he predicted that magical practice would eventually be understood in psychological terms, which many occultists now do, following thinkers like Rigardi, also Dion Fortune, or Jung, who indeed bridged those. Yeah, Dion Fortune is the great unsung hero of that. He wrote one of the first sympathetic studies of mysticism in psychological lens, through a psychological lens, in his Science and Buddhism essay and his 8 lectures on yoga, which everyone should read. These contributions show a mind looking to synthesize and classify human spiritual experience rationally, which is indeed a kind of intellectual genius, often credited to later academics like William James in Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, which Crowley read and corresponded with James about. Crowley was right there in those conversations. It's also interesting how Crowley anticipated certain quantum or relativistic thinking in his metaphors. He wrote about the universe being continuous and events relative to viewpoint in his concept of every man and every woman as a star, meaning each has their own universe perspective or perspective of the universe. He wasn't a scientist in training. He dropped out of formal science early, but his polymath curiosity and imaginative thinking allowed him to grasp some cutting-edge concepts intuitively. Conclusion on genius. Crowley's intelligence was broad, covering creative, analytical, linguistic domains, and in some respects deep. He fits the mold of a gifted but unbalanced genius, the kind that shines in certain arenas but is, quote, twice exceptional in others, meaning exceptional ability and concomitant disability, e.g. exceptional creativity, but also mental illness. If one uses the term genius to mean an extraordinarily original or influential thinker, Crowley qualifies within his niche of esotericism. His stamp on modern occult practice is immense, as most later groups either follow or react to his thelemic methods. Yeah, and I would argue that he has not been surpassed. Not yet, at least. If one means it as general greatest mind of his time, that would be too strong. He lacked the restraint and consistency to be an Edison or Einstein, who, though also eccentric, managed to harness genius more productively. Perhaps a fair statement is, Crowley possessed genius-level talents, but his personality disorders and life choices prevented full realization of their positive potential. Instead, his genius often served his pathology, e.g. using clever words to justify cruelty, or using brilliant strategic thinking to manipulate rather than build mutual success. Yeah, manipulating people is not really an autistic thing. It's much more an NPD thing. This interplay of brilliance and dysfunction is at the heart of why Crowley fascinates. He was at once an Oxford-educated intellectual and poet of high culture and a self-described beast wallowing in taboo and excess. The tension between these facets is not just biographical, but cognitive. He inhabited high abstract mind states and base instinctual states, not well integrated. In the end, his creative output stands as a testament that remarkable intellectual achievements can emerge from a mind also rife with chaos. It underscores that intelligence alone doesn't equate to wisdom or mental health, but when channeled, it can produce works that outlive the messy workshop of their creation. That's quite a turn of phrase. Crowley's writings continue to be studied and built upon, meaning that the creative part of his mind succeeded in communicating something valuable, even if the man himself could not embody the balance or coherence one might hope such genius would confer. All right. The next section is life phases and personality evolution, where we look at the stages of his life. But before that, let's go to the super chats, as promised. Thank you so much for these lovely, lovely SCs. Okay, Anna Dean asks, is burning out into madness inevitable when one contains and processes this much full spectrum intelligence? No, I don't think so. And if anything, many of the tools offered by, or not necessarily offered, but brought to people's awareness by Crowley and people like him, for instance, Raja Yoga, and meditation, and just general like self-analysis, can be very, very helpful in capacitating. I think that Crowley, in terms of somebody who capacitated that much intelligence, did a far better job than, I mean, who else can we even compare him to? Paul Foster Case? Carlos Castaneda? You know? So, and I think that Crowley's students, for instance, Israel Regardie and Dion Fortune, really did a good job of offering even more techniques to balance yourself out while doing this. But Dion Fortune and Regardie were very, very big on therapy as something to undertake in conjunct with Magick. Now we have all kinds of tools. We've got EMDR, EFT. We have modern psychological chemical tools, right, which can be very, very helpful for people. So no, I don't think so. And people, the idea that it's like this Lovecraftian idea that if anyone messes with magic, they will go insane, and Beelzebub will come from the depths to grab their balls and or ovaries for all eternity. No, that's not really the case. And I will say that I don't think that Crowley's personal failings were caused by magic. You know, they're very much, what this shows is they're very much tied in with his actual wiring and his upbringing and his early trauma. And magic, in many ways, was his method of containing and structuring all of that. So it's a lot more complex than that. But no, I don't think so. I have a very positive take on these subjects, or I wouldn't teach them. Great question. Elizabeth asks, what do you think were some of Crowley's biggest cognitive biases? And what would you say is the biggest takeaway from his life for modern occultists today? That's a huge question. Cognitive biases, I think, relating everything to his own internal mythology. Right? Like everything for him was, you know, a resonance from the Book of the Law, a communication from Secret Chief, something confirming, you know, everything was part of his, you know, personal path of apotheosis. And that can be very, very profound and, you know, it can be incredible to engage with, but also, as this report mentioned, it can lead to, how do I put it? It can lead to accepting personal failures as inevitable, or accepting, you know, like your life can completely fall apart due to negligence. And then you can convince yourself that this is part of some occult process that you have to be purged to go to the next thing. That's not very healthy. So I think that what the biggest takeaway is what, you know, obviously watch your confirmation bias. I could not do justice what of the biggest takeaway is. But I'll just give you some stuff because there's so much. But I think just things that come to the top of my head. I think that one, if I'm going to offer one thing, it's be a normal person. What I mean by that, you know, the Rosicrucians in the Rosicrucian manifestos, which Crowley loved and paid lip service to this idea, it says that Rosicrucians should act and dress and be like everyone around them. And that in their case should not proclaim anything about themselves other than the ability to heal. So I think that is a good takeaway. Be normal. And by normal, I mean be socially engaged with the world and other people, and have interests and friends that do not revolve around the occult, and keep it compartmentalized. so many of it, like there's so many religious people in this world who are Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, but they don't make their faith their whole thing that they have to drag everyone into. It's their private practice, right? And I think that in many ways, that's how magic is best done. It's something private and sacred to the self, that you don't go shouting from the rooftops. Now, that said, if Crowley hadn't been this bombastic, it's possible that magic, and certainly the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, would have been completely forgotten. So there's also that. And so if he hadn't been such a bizarre character, would anyone care about magic? Like, would anybody give two shits about Paul Foster Case if he had been the main person to carry the current forward? No. The answer is simply no. Where meanwhile, Crowley's, all over heavy metal albums, and, every new generation often becomes fascinated with him. Excellent question. All right. Dreamgoat says, hey, Jason, do you think the symbolic language attributed to the archetypes within Jung's system is at odds with the correspondences within the Western system? Great question. And thank you for the super chat. I don't know, because I actually haven't read a lot of Carl Jung. I made a point, maybe this is probably just laziness, but I've made a point not to read Carl Jung because I don't want to get the Jungian disease of turning everything into my Jungian archetypes. Jung is an interesting case because he occupies such a halfway point between the world of the normies and the world of magicians, in as much as he went as far into magic as normies could take it, and a little farther, by saying it's all psychological archetypes and giving it that, psychologizing it away. But you can't psychologize magic away. You can't just say that, that for instance, the Goetia are all parts of the human brain, because these things do have independent existence to some extent. Magic does have effects which are beyond the individual. So that Jungian barrier can really trap people and keep them in this weird halfway zone where they can't make progress. So I've tried to, I have, and I made a point of intentionally resisting that. There's nothing against Jung, but long way of saying, too long didn't read. I don't know enough about Jung's system to say. But great question. People in the chat may know more. All right. All right, moving on. Life phases and personality evolution. Crowley's long journey, he lived 72 years, can be divided into distinct life stages, each marked by different focal conflicts and psychological states. Analyzing his personality evolution across these phases reveals patterns of ego expansion and contraction, and moments of both development and regression. Let's examine each major phase identified in the prompt, tying in how Crowley's ego, sense of self, and personality characteristics shifted or ossified over time, and what psychological drivers were prominent in each. 1. Cambridge University and mountaineering, 1895 to 99. Key features of this period: youthful exploration, male idealization, and drive for conquest and adventure. During his Cambridge years, Crowley experienced his first taste of freedom from the Brethren's constraints. Psychologically, that's Plymouth Brethren, the evangelical cult he was raised in. Psychologically, this was a period of identity experimentation. He had not yet declared war on society. He was more a dilettante testing limits. He engaged in the male homosocial culture of the university, bonding over chess, poetry, and sex. There's an element of male idealization here. This would be consistent for somebody who lost a father, right, at an early age, and is also just normal for that stage of life, where young men idealize men that they want to become like, because they're still finding out who they are. He fell in love with Herbert Paulet, who was a charismatic older student. This suggests Crowley at 20 still sought an ideal, beloved male figure. Yeah, and it says right here, possibly a transfer of the lost father image. Paulet was somewhat older and worldly. When Crowley broke off with Pollitt to pursue the occult, it was not out of animosity, but a feeling of higher calling. Ego-wise, at this stage, Crowley's narcissism was present, but not yet prophetic. He wanted to be a great poet and mountaineer, which are lofty but conventional ambitions. His mountaineering reveals a conquest drive. Nothing wrong with that. Likely serving as a socially acceptable outlet for aggression and mastery. The sheer danger and leadership required in climbs, like on Shogori K2 in 1902, though technically after Cambridge, this is a little bit out of order. So his climb, Shogori K2 in 1902, was technically conducted after he was out of Cambridge, but it was planned when he was at Cambridge. So the sheer danger and leadership required in climbs like that satisfied Crowley's need to prove himself. On mountains, Crowley exhibited courage, but also recklessness and authoritarianism. On the 1902 K2 attempt, he quarreled with teammates and pressed on despite avalanche risk, arguably causing a rift that ended the expedition. It also somebody died on this expedition, which Crowley is accused of ignoring and letting him die, but it's possible that he just may not have, it would have been impossible to save him, and Crowley realized that. This foreshadows his pattern. Brilliance and bravery undermined by interpersonal friction and hubris. At Cambridge's end, Crowley's ego is inflating, but not yet mythologically. It's the ego of a young prodigy convinced of his special destiny, but still channeling it through Victorian paradigms. For instance, success in sport, literature, and social clubs. The Oedipal revolt against Christianity was brewing. He was writing blasphemous poems privately. Yeah, White Stain, Sword of Song, etc. Richard Kaczynski just published a new edition of The Sword of Song, which is probably his most directly anti-Christian work. The Oedipal revolt against Christianity was brewing, but he hadn't publicly declared himself the beast yet. In summary, in this phase, Crowley's personality is characterized by high energy, curiosity, relatively intact social functioning. He had friends, lovers, and mentors, but also seeds of arrogance and contrarianism. The resolution of adolescence into adulthood saw him consciously reject a conventional career, such as academia or diplomacy. I believe he did want to be a diplomat at one point, in favor of magical destiny. This is where his ego identity begins to merge with Frater Perdurabo, the magical name he took in 1898, meaning I will endure, a sign he's framing his life as an alchemical quest rather than a normal profession. How dare he? I don't know anyone like that. 2. The Golden Dawn Rebellion period, 1899 to 1900. Key features: conflict with authority and the emergence of messianic fantasy. This brief but pivotal phase, when Crowley joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and then was involved in its schism, marks the first, so this time period is just the schism part, and I think they got the dates wrong because it extended longer, but we'll take it as that general period. This brief but pivotal phase marks the first major ego crisis of his adult life. He entered the Golden Dawn hungry for recognition and power. He zoomed through the lower grades thanks to his ability and the backlog of knowledge he already had. But the established adepts, Mathers, Westcott, Yates, etc., saw him as brash and unmannered. They blocked his advancement to the inner order partly because of class prejudice and Crowley's bisexual reputation. This is true. I mean, one of the reasons they just straight up didn't, the Golden Dawn considered Crowley a man of low morals and didn't like him, was just that he was bisexual, right? Which is not considered any failing today, but was illegal at the time. Oscar Wilde had recently been imprisoned for it. This is interesting. It says, and it also says class prejudice, which is interesting. Crowley's response was rage and rebellion. He allied with Mathers in a contested takeover attempt of the London Temple, the famous Battle of Blythe Road, where he, in a somewhat absurd costume, tried to seize the vault of the Adepti. Psychologically, this was an infantile reenactment. Crowley, feeling unjustly weaned or refused by the magical parent figures, throws a tantrum and tries to smash the nursery. It's the Oedipal drama. Yeats and others, older men, said, "You're not ready," so the son tries to overthrow the fathers. This is where we first see a full messiah or martyr complex in Crowley. He started to frame the Golden Dawn's refusal as ignorance of his destined role. He wrote in later years that he believed the secret chiefs, mysterious occult supervisors, that's like the least glamorous description I've ever heard of them, mysterious occult supervisors, had chosen him to revivify the order, and the London adepts were blinded by jealousy. So his ego rationalized the conflict as Crowley is the enlightened one versus blind authorities. Interesting turn of phrase, blind authorities, which suggests Gnostic concepts, shall we say, for those who have ears to hear. A narrative he'd repeat often. We can surmise his personality at this stage was hot-headed, unbridled, and already quite grandiose. Others remarked on his condescension. Yet he also felt bitterness at rejection, an early sign of paranoia under stress. They're all against me, the incompetents. After the failed coup, Crowley left Britain for Mexico. This suggests that when his ego was wounded, his coping was to flee and start anew, where his past reputation wouldn't hinder him. He doesn't collapse inward. Instead, he externally projects blame and moves on, an often adaptive but not necessarily reflective strategy. Yeah, we call this Eric Cartmaning. Thus, in the Golden Dawn fiasco, we see the solidification of his adversarial stance to the establishment. It contributed to his self-image as a polarizing force. Let's get that out of the way. You've seen it enough. One who, by destiny, must fight orthodoxy. Here magical rather than Christian orthodoxy, but symbolically similar. This is perfect. This is completely standard for magical orders, by the way. These petty little dramas playing out. We also see borderline-like splitting. The Golden Dawn went from being his dream community to being all worthless in his eyes once they opposed him. He demonized former allies like W.B. Yeats. Crowley later wrote nasty poems about Yeats, and also, as I've said before, wrote one of the funniest jokes I have ever heard, which is so, maybe you won't think it's funny because it's so subtle, but I love it, where in Conks on Pax, he just has a line is, "What are Yeats?" I think that's hilarious. This black and white relational pattern stuck through his life. Three, the Book of the Law revelation, Cairo, 1904. Full narcissistic inflation. Key features: apex of grandiosity, cosmic purpose, and identity as prophet. As previously discussed, receiving Liber al Vel Legis was the turning point where Crowley's ego identity became wedded to the transcendent source. Up to 1903, he was an adept, a capable occultist, among others. After 1904, he considered himself the prophet of the new aeon, qualitatively above others. The immediate aftermath shows an interesting oscillation. At first, he was somewhat skeptical or resistant. He didn't publish the Book of the Law widely until 1909. Possibly some neurotic doubt or modesty fought with his surge of narcissism. He wasn't quite ready to come out as world teacher. But by 1909, under influence of new scarlet women like Rose and later Jean Foster, he embraced it fully, republishing it with commentary. Yeah, the great unsung heroes of Crowley's life are the women in his life, and any male magician worth their salt understands that women are the engine of revelation, and men just kind of like pick up the pieces or structure it. So this phase, 1904-1913 roughly, is Crowley at his most confident and evangelistic. He created the AA in 1907 as a new magical order structured, frankly, around his law of Thelema and his curriculum. He saw this era as him fulfilling his mission. Ego-wise, this is inflation and creative expansion combined. He was productive, charismatic. He attracted many students like Victor Neuberg. It says Alan Bennett was one of his students. This is completely not true. But he says he attracted many students like Victor Neuberg and then later JFC Fuller. People described him in lectures around 1912 in London as mesmerizing despite his notorious reputation. He had that proselytizing fire. Narcissistic personality disorder thrives on an admiring audience, and he had somewhat of a crowd in this period. However, even here his flaws seeded future issues. He demanded from followers absolute devotion, which wasn't sustainable. One by one, many early AA members dropped off, often disillusioned by his personal behavior. Fuller left in disgust over Crowley's increasing public scandal. It's also worth pointing out here that looking at Crowley's early life, you really cannot overestimate the effect of his bisexuality on him in alienating him from people around him, which we would look at today as a failing, as quite frankly, a failing of the people around him, not him. The main reason that Fuller broke with him is Fuller was basically disgusted by his homosexuality, and because he was in the military, did not want it rubbing off on him, so to speak. And so there's that. Fuller later became a follower of Oswald Mosley and one of the top members of the British Union of Fascists, and invented blitzkrieg warfare, which later he brought to Adolf Hitler to disturbing effect. So Fuller had his own issues and need of idealizing some ultra-masculine ideal as well. So there's two sides to these stories. People described him in lectures around 1912 in London as mesmerizing, despite his notorious rep. Oh, here we go. Okay. Fuller left in disgust over Crowley's increasing public scandal. Crowley responded by vilifying those who left, labeling them traitors or failures, again splitting. So while externally it's a high point, internally relationships are brittle. This epoch also includes the first Abbey attempt. Not Cefalù, but a proto-Abbey in 1913 in Sicily, an OTO gathering at Villa Tornator. I didn't even know about this, which ended with local scandal as well. These trial runs show how his psychosexual disintegration was creeping in under the banner of Magick. Pushing group sex and drugs, even among somewhat conventional occultists, caused backlash. Yeah, Keith says fascists constantly worried they're gay. Pretty funny. It's a type. Crowley couldn't understand why others didn't revel in transgression like he did, a blind spot indicative of either spectrum issues or self-centeredness. 4. The Abbey of Thelema, 1920-23, psychosexual disintegration and failed utopia. Key features: peak of experimental living, unrestrained id, community leader role failed. At the Abbey in Cefalù, Crowley attempted to live entirely by Thelema. Psychologically, one might frame this as an attempt at self-actualization, to fully realize his ideal environment and identity. It was an exercise in intentional regression, too. He believed that by shedding bourgeois norms, clothes, diet, monogamy, etc., and living like primitives guided by will, a more authentic life would result. You can really trace that idea back throughout, all the way back to Rousseau. This is a common and very misguided stream of thought in Western liberal thinking. From a trauma perspective, it was maybe an attempt to redo family life on his own terms. He, the benevolent or not so benevolent patriarch / guru with a household of children, disciples, and actual children, his and others. Perhaps unconsciously, he was trying to heal the wounds of his Plymouth Brethren childhood by creating an anti-Brethren commune. The result, however, was largely chaotic. Crowley's personality at this stage had deteriorated in some respects. Heavy drug use made him less consistent and more moody. Eyewitness diaries like those of disciple Raoul Loveday's wife Betty May paint him as alternating between inspirational teacher and cruel taskmaster. He instituted bizarre educational practices, like having one woman overcome her disgust by meditating in a room with a rotting cat, or requiring acts of defiance to break inhibitions that speak to sadistic and psychopathic tendencies overtaking his judgment. It's as if in the Abbey environment, all his impulses had free rein under rationalization of spiritual exercise. There was no external check. He was answerable to none, and internal checks, like his rational mind, were clouded by heroin and grandiosity. Ego regression is evident. Crowley, in his writing from Cefalù, sometimes refers to himself in third person, as if observing the beast operate, a possible sign of his ego splitting under stress. The fiasco with Loveday's death and the subsequent eviction by Mussolini's government was a massive narcissistic injury. His perfect utopia was labeled a cult of debauchery in tabloids. He was deeply humiliated and angry. After 1923, Crowley enters a phase of ego collapse and attempt to reassemble. The mid-20s see him cast about Europe with less direction, struggling with addiction and finances. He goes from being a leader surrounded by acolytes to a solitary wanderer, often reliant on one or two supporters at a time, like writers in Germany who gave him lodging, or in his later life, I believe he was almost single-handedly being supported by Carl and Sasha Germer in California. We can interpret this as severe narcissistic injury resulting in partial ego fragmentation. He lost his kingdom, and thus his identity as Master Therion was in crisis. He tried to reclaim it by writing his autobiography, The Confessions, during the late 20s, an attempt to cement his legacy and narratively prove his greatness despite failure. But that remained unfinished. Symbolically, his ego narrative remained incomplete in his own eyes. 5. Exile and Addiction, 1924-34. Collapse, poverty, megalomania perseveres. Key features: external decline, internal clinging to grandiosity, attempts at reinvention. During this decade, Crowley hit rock bottom externally. Infamous, broke, physically ill. We see signs of depression in diaries. He'd write of despair, cursing fate, yet the spark of grandiosity never extinguished. It's possible when the split between grandiose self and depleted real self, It's possibly when the split between grandiose self and depleted real self was starkest. He still proclaimed himself ipsissimus, but around him was squalor. People with NPD often suffer such splits when reality no longer affirms their self-image. They might double down on fantasy of superiority to cope. Crowley did exactly that. E.g., in 1927, he wrote Liber 2, The Message of the Master Therion, which calmly states, "Do what thou wilt as the law," as if he's an active world teacher, even though at that moment he had perhaps one or two correspondence students left. It's delusional perseverance, arguably protecting him from suicidal collapse. However, glimpses of insight sometimes emerged. He had correspondence with psychologist friends like Dr. Maurice Nicoll, who tried to help him see his predicament. There's a letter around 1930 where Crowley wonders if he had perhaps made mistakes and should adapt, something he rarely admitted. But then he quickly reverts to, "No, they're all wrong, I shall yet triumph." So insight was fleeting. Again, Eric Cartmaning. One interesting personality shift here is pragmatism creeping in. In the 1930s, Crowley made several practical moves. He courted new followers like Carl Germer to handle money. He settled back in London and tried integrating with a small artistic circle. He attended poetry readings, etc., albeit as the weird old mage. This shows an ego adaptation, accepting he can't be mainstream adored, but maybe he can salvage a niche. His writing tone in Magick Without Tears, letters in the early 40s, is actually avuncular and straightforward, a far cry from the bombast of earlier works. That indicates some mellowing and willingness to explain patiently, perhaps learned from failures to communicate effectively before. 6. Late years, 1934 to 47. Attempted synthesis, bitter isolation. Key features: summing up legacy, managing persona, alternating between humility and resentment. In the final stage, Crowley settled into being more of an archivist of his own myth. He oversaw the publication of what he considered his magnum opuses: the Book of Thoth, the Tarot Deck and Book, new editions of Magick, the book Magick, and nurtured protégés like Grady McMurtry from afar. At times, he wrote to colleagues with something approaching remorse, e.g., praising former foes. He once remarked that maybe Mathers had taught him good lessons after all, a rare conciliatory note. This could indicate, as death neared, some integration of conflicting parts, recognizing shades of gray in those he once villainized. Nonetheless, he also had episodes of bitterness and doubling down. There are reports he would rail about how unappreciated his work was, how stupid the world was not to embrace Thelema. This is typical of an aging narcissist whose grandiosity finds no external validation. They can become deeply bitter and paranoid. The people will regret not listening to me attitude. Crowley's final words, these are likely apocryphal. We don't know. Other people may know better, but I don't actually think. I think that this was something that John Simons came up with. Crowley's final recorded words, "I am perplexed, Satan get out," if accurate, are poignant, suggesting perhaps at the very end he felt some doubt or inner torment. So I'm not going to dwell on that because I don't necessarily think that was actually said. In any case, in his final year, he was largely alone. His children not with him, only a couple of devotees around. That isolation was partly consequence of his own making, burned bridges, and partly the fate of a controversial figure. During World War II, he made some attempts to offer services to British intelligence, likely fantasizing a last heroic role. The refusal or lack of serious interest might have reinforced his sense of neglect by society. What actually happened here was that Ian Fleming, yes, that Ian Fleming who created James Bond and later based the villain Blofeld on Crowley, Ian Fleming was in charge of a plan to fool Rudolf Hess, who was a high-ranking Nazi, with fake astrological charts, because it was known that Hess was making military plans based on astrological calculations. So Fleming thought that hiring Crowley to forge astrological charts for Hess to get him to make wrong movements. That was his idea, but the brass never accepted it, so the plan never went off. He did, however, invent the V for victory sign, which he called a pentacle. The V being 5, Geburah, so this was the symbol for the English at that time. The refusal or lack of serious interest, well, he was refused at the end, might have reinforced his sense of neglect by society. A friend said Crowley cried when the war ended because he realized he'd play no part in big world events. He was sidelined by history. That is a huge narcissistic injury. The world moved without the great beast at center stage. His health also forced a collapse of will to some degree. In diaries, he occasionally laments that, quote, "magic power doesn't cure my asthma," a tacit admission of limits. So by the end, Crowley's ego map had contracted from "I'll change the world" to perhaps "I'll preserve my teachings for posterity." The effort to re-release works and correspond with future leaders, like instructing Germer and McMurtry on OTO succession, shows he still believed in the eventual victory of his law, just that he accepted it might happen after his death. This is a slight evolution. Earlier, he often predicted immediate global impact. Later, he contented himself that maybe in 100 years it would take hold. He told followers to bury a time capsule of his stuff for future discovery. Frankly, I think that's quite likely. I was talking to Alan Chapman in the on the podcast, and he was saying he doesn't think that the sun has risen on Crowley yet, and I would tend to agree. Since hopefully most of us will be alive 100 years after Crowley's death, since that'll be 2047, we can find out. In terms of ego structure, early life, childhood to 20s, he had a fragile ego, rebellious but needing attention. Midlife, 30s to 40s, an inflated, grandiose ego with messianic delusions. Late life, 60s to 70s, a deflated yet stubborn ego, alternating between regret and defiance. One might say there was a chance for an ego death in true mystical sense, transcending his persona truly into compassionate enlightenment. But if it happened, it's not strongly evidenced. Instead, his persona died with him, leaving a complex legacy. Rigardi's observation was that Crowley suffered greatly by his own persona. But somewhere behind that mask there was a real human being, possibly craving simple love, which he never allowed himself to receive or show, paraphrasing from Rigardi's Eye in the Triangle. If that's true, one could interpret that in the very final phase, occasionally the real human peeped through. For example, he doted on a little dog at Netherwood, and neighbors recall him being gentle with animals. Interesting, given his cruelty to a cat as a youth. I believe the cat story is also apocryphal. It's like a loop closure. Harming an animal. I don't think he actually did that. I think this is another thing that John Simons made up. In summary, Crowley's life phases illustrate a rise and fall arc typical of tragic heroes. Youthful promise, hubristic peak, downfall, and a quieter final chapter of reflection, albeit not full redemption. Each phase left a mark on his personality. Early rebel, contrarian creative. Prophet ascendancy, charismatic but showing seeds of his downfall via arrogance and excess. Downfall, severe consequences leading to partial insight and adaptation, but also bitterness. End, a complex mix of self-awareness and stubborn clinging to identity. A lonely legend in his own mind. Whew. By the way, we're coming up to this end of the section, so now's the time to get your super chat in. We've got 4 more paragraphs, and I will then take a break to read any super chats, so get them in now. From a clinical perspective, one sees a man who did not fundamentally transform his character structure despite all his mystical work. He remained in many ways the lonely, defiant boy fighting parental figures, be they God, society, or rivals, until the end. He achieved extraordinary feats of mind and imagination, but perhaps not of personal growth in empathy or relational capacity. Each life stage brought out or exaggerated different facets of his personality disorder spectrum, from borderline rage in the Golden Dawn to manic narcissism in the 1910s, to antisocial indulgence in the 20s, to depressive narcissism in the 30s, to somewhat mellow but still narcissistic in final years. I'll get to that. As an ego map, one can conclude Crowley's arc never found a stable integration of his genius self and his wounded self. They remained in tension. His final, and by the way, healing that split between, Magick loves to talk about the higher self and all of this, but really, healing that split between the genius self and the wounded self, or let's say the magical self and the wounded self, that is mandatory for all magicians if you want to be successful. And it's a lifelong task. It really is. That's some real magic. Heal and resolve or negotiate your internal conflicts. And understand why you do the things that you do so that you're not just reacting blindly to something in your past, which is almost everyone. So to repeat, as an ego map, one can conclude Crowley's arc never found a stable integration of his genius self and his wounded self. They remained in tension. His final self-diagnosis in a Magick Without Tears letter, I am somewhat of a megalomaniac and must be forgiven because every true adept is one. That sentence captures his unrepentant yet knowing stance. He recognized his megalomania but justified it as part of being who he was. It implies that even at the threshold of death, he still rationalized he was still rationalizing rather than experiencing remorse. The lack of true regret or apology in his autobiographical writings is telling. He thought he'd do it all again, just do it better. Therefore, the evolution was more in external circumstances and intensity than a fundamental inner metamorphosis. Crowley's personality was remarkably consistent in its core: creative, egotistical, risk-taking, domineering, curious, erratic, but manifested differently as youth, as prophet, as outcast, as elder. Those phases illustrate how environment and aging can modulate a personality, but not necessarily overhaul it, especially absent formal therapy or willingness to change. Crowley in each stage doubled down on being Crowley, for better or worse. Thus his life reads almost archetypally as the fool's journey in tarot terms. The fool, seeker, starting fresh, becoming the magus, encountering devils and towers, falls, and ending perhaps as the hermit. Whether he reached the world completion card is doubtful, but he certainly lived through dramatic major arcana of his own working. Very insightful, AI. All right, so next up we have differential diagnosis and clinical summary. Let's take a look at the chat. Thank you, Charles. Charles Yeager puts in a super chat. Thank you very much, with no question. And I think that's the only one. Okay. But I did want to respond to people are talking about the V for victory sign. Brandon says, I was taught in school it was Churchill who had purposefully popularized it, which is interesting if true, because it means that Churchill had adopted the sign from Crowley somehow. No, that's exactly right. Crowley created that for Churchill and gave it to him. Something that's, it's like, there's so many things like that in Crowley's life that are just so phenomenal that it is amazing that they all happen to one person. There's so many things that people gloss over with him that are just incredible like that. All right. You can continue to super chat and I will catch them on the next section break. Differential diagnosis and clinical summary. Given the extensive information gathered about Aleister Crowley's life and behavior, we can now attempt a clinical formulation, assigning diagnostic labels per modern criteria, DSM-V or ICD-11, and differentiating between overlapping conditions. We will also distinguish which aspects of his presentation stem from core personality structure versus those due to trauma, substance effects, or authentic spiritual experiences. Personality disorders. The consensus of evidence points most strongly to narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, with prominent antisocial, psychopathic features. Crowley consistently exhibited the hallmarks of NPD, a grandiose sense of self-importance, believing he was a world historical prophet, boasting of genius, fantasies of unlimited success and power, aiming to become the lord of a new aeon, expecting Thelema to reshape civilization, a need for excessive admiration, he cultivated followers and often wrote about craving recognition, a sense of entitlement, demanding special treatment and obedience, e.g., expecting disciples to finance him or break laws for him, interpersonal exploitiveness, using people for sex, money, or magical experiments without true empathy for their well-being, lack of empathy, numerous instances of callousness from animal cruelty, and there was the goat incident in Sheffield, so even if the cat thing is not real, there was animal cruelty later. From animal cruelty to dismissing a disciple's death as magically necessary. He also showed envy and belief others were envious of him. He often claimed critics were just jealous of his attainment. These criteria align almost perfectly with DSM definitions. As one modern clinician summarized, Crowley exhibited chronic symptoms associated with all 9 criteria of NPD, meaning he would unequivocally meet diagnosis. How narcissistic disorder often co-occurs or shades into antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, psychopathy. NPD often shades into ASPD, antisocial personality disorder, or psychopathy. Crowley's score on Hare's psychopathy checklist has been retrospectively estimated at 38 out of 40. Suggesting strong psychopathic traits: superficial charm, grandiosity, need for stimulation, thrill-seeking and mountaineering, sexual exploits, pathological lying, he lied freely in propaganda or in telling tall tales, conning and manipulation, ensnaring people into funding him or performing taboo acts, lack of remorse, he rarely, if ever, expressed genuine remorse for hurting others, shallow affect, except anger and ecstasy, he didn't display deep warmth or guilt, poor behavioral controls, many impulsive rages and whims, promiscuous sexual behavior, early behavioral problems, and criminal versatility. While he wasn't a conventional criminal, he violated social norms and laws routinely, e.g. drug law, bigamy, etc., and relished being the wickedest man in the world. So he likely meets ASPD criteria as well, though his was a cultured sort of psychopathy, rarely leading to common crime, but manifesting in exploitation and rule breaking. The key difference: he did have a guiding purpose, true will, beyond mere personal gain. That doesn't excuse behavior, but means he was not aimless. Some might term him a malignant narcissist, which is basically NPD plus ASPD plus paranoid and sadistic tendencies. Woo. His sadistic streak, enjoying others' suffering or humiliation, is well attested. For example, he took pleasure in degrading rituals and arguably in seeing disciples struggle. This could qualify for sadistic personality, which is not in the DSM-V but is discussed in literature. Borderline personality traits. Crowley also manifested traits of borderline personality disorder, BPD, though not the full clinical picture. He had intense unstable relationships, idealizing a new Scarlet Woman, then viciously devaluing and discarding her, frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. If a follower left, he tried to magically attack or emotionally blackmail them, a sort of extreme response to perceived betrayal akin to BPD rage. Identity disturbance. He had shifting self-concepts, poet, prophet, secret agent, etc., and underlying feelings of emptiness when his grand projects failed, suggested by his periodic depressions and heavy substance use to fill voids, and self-damaging impulsivity, drugs, risky sex, spending sprees. However, he did not exhibit self-mutilation or overt suicidal gestures. Those are common in BPD, but he tended to externalize pain rather than self-harm. Well, there is jagoram, but, His risk-taking might be seen as indirect self-harm, though. He also could be effectively unstable. Mood swings and intense anger outbursts are documented. So while narcissism was dominant, borderline dynamics underlay many relational patterns. We might say he had a cluster B personality disorder, mixed narcissistic borderline with antisocial features. Bipolar disorder. There is strong suggestion that Crowley had a mood disorder of the bipolar spectrum, Many accounts of his life fit a cyclic pattern of elevated energetic periods and depressed lethargic periods. Interestingly, he even made that a hallmark of the Equinox, his journal, which he said would publish intensely for a short period of time and then would lay fallow, meaning he published volume 1, there was no volume 2, and much later he attempted to publish volume 3 by design. Interesting. During what appeared to be hypomanic episodes, he was extraordinarily productive, writing multiple books in weeks, needing little sleep, brimming with confidence. For example, in 1909 to 11, he was juggling multiple huge projects seemingly inexhaustibly. His letters from those times exude rapid thoughts and grand plans. Conversely, after major failure, Crowley is eternally coming up with all these genius ideas that he can't execute. He can't keep up with his own brain. And if you read his diaries, he's always kind of like on to the next big thing, his next big scheme, his next big breakthrough, his next grade. Conversely, after major failures For example, in 1909 to 11, he was juggling multiple huge projects seemingly inexhaustibly. His letters from those times exude rapid thoughts and grand plans. Conversely, after major failures or drug binges, he sank into weeks or months of inertia and pessimism. E.g., late 1920s in Berlin, he wrote almost nothing and contemplated, quote, closing up shop. Bipolar II, hypomania plus depression, is likely. It might also be a cyclothymic disorder, given the chronic nature of fluctuations, and perhaps not full mania. But some episodes, like 1913, when he staged outrageously grand public rites, that's the rites of Aloysius, or when he went on his impractical African trek in 1920, I don't know about that one, border on mania with delusional grandeur and risky acts. A-C-T-S, acts. Substances complicate the picture. Cocaine can trigger mania-like symptoms. Withdrawal from opioids can trigger depression, etc. So differential. Are his highs drug-induced or innate? Possibly both. He used cocaine to fuel high-energy states, but one reason he got into drugs might be because he was predisposed to seek highs. If bipolar, one might self-medicate depression with stimulants and mania with depressants, which ironically he did. Coke for up, heroin for calm. Don't do this. Thus, I'd lean, he did have an underlying bipolar disorder, aggravated by drug use. Notably, he had some family history of psychiatric issues. His father was highly rigid but died young. His mother might have had some hysteria. One niece reportedly had mental illness. Hard to draw conclusions from scant data, but biologically, it's plausible. Schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. These were considered by Regardie and others, but largely ruled out. Crowley did not exhibit sustained hallucinations outside of ritual context, nor did he show disorganized thinking in everyday matters. He was capable of linear work and complex analysis, which schizophrenics typically aren't consistently. His delusions were more systematized and ego-syntonic, fitting his personality, rather than bizarre or fragmentation of personality. Regardie argued Crowley was not a schizophrenic because he had too much self-discipline for that. However, Crowley himself once referred to schizophrenic we all are, I just don't hide my conflicting attitudes, using the term loosely to mean split between public persona and inner feelings, perhaps. So clinically, not schizophrenic in DSM sense. Possibly at most, schizotypal personality due to his magical beliefs and eccentric behavior. But his charm and engagement with others, plus the well-elaborated spiritual philosophy, differentiate him from a typical schizotypal who is usually socially anxious, isolated, with fragmented magical thinking. Crowley's thinking was magical but highly articulated, and he wasn't shy. He was gregarious when it suited him, so I'd favor narcissist over schizotypal. Autism spectrum disorder, level 1 Asperger's. So autism, ASD, and Asperger's used to be considered separate things. Now they're not. Asperger's, which people tend to think of as high functioning autism, is now referred to as level 1 autism, meaning autism spectrum traits, but not needing care, not being able to care for yourself without external caretakers. ASD. We should address this differential given speculation. Signs 4. Obsessive interests, occult minutiae, lack of filter in social situations, difficulty maintaining reciprocal relationships, somewhat pedantic speech at times, and possible sensory peculiarities. He was extremely affected by certain art or music, but that's common to many. Signs against. His social manipulation and lying indicate a theory of mind and deceptive skill that is not typical in ASD. Yeah, not just not typical, but almost anathema. He also enjoyed metaphor, irony, complex humor. Autistics often have more literal thinking, though not always. Crowley could definitely infer and play on others' emotions when he wanted to, e.g. writing letters tailored to manipulate donors. That suggests he wasn't mind blind, he just chose to exploit rather than empathize. So ASD is a much weaker fit than cluster B personality disorders. If anything, maybe a touch of obsessive-compulsive personality, rigid devotion to systems, lists, diaries, overlay, but he was too disorganized in areas, finances, and his environment, to actually qualify for OCPD, which usually entails hyper-orderliness. Some aspects of Crowley, like his ritual perfectionism, were OCPD-like, but his lifestyle was messy. PTSD/CPTSD. We identified clear childhood traumas, emotional abuse by mother, sexual abuse attempts, bullying. Crowley did show some phenomena consistent. I don't think it was sexual abuse attempts, by the way. It was sexual abuse by a male tutor. Crowley did show some phenomena consistent with complex PTSD, emotional dysregulation, anger outbursts, addictions as self-soothing, negative self-concept deep down, despite outward grandiosity, one senses a damaged self-esteem fueling it, and difficulty with interpersonal trust and intimacy, the sabotaged relationships likely due to fear of betrayal. Every close bond ended in rancor, which is often a CPTSD pattern from attachment trauma. He also reenacted trauma themes, e.g. being persecuted or controlled. He constantly created situations where he had to rebel or felt persecuted, which reenacted his childhood with controlling religious family. So I would give a provisional diagnosis of CPTSD, or at least acknowledge significant trauma-related symptoms fueling his pathology. Notably, his nightmares or flashbacks aren't well recorded. He likely wouldn't admit vulnerability if he had them. But nightmares of his mother's religious curses or Malvern bullying could have haunted him, although this is speculation. Substance use disorders. These are straightforward. Opioid use disorder, severe, in sustained use until death, and stimulant cocaine use disorder, moderate to severe, episodic. Also alcohol use disorder, mild maybe. He drank but not majorly. His focus was drugs. And cannabis use disorder, mild or just regular use. He advocated hashish for visions, but there was no evidence he got addicted. It was more occasional. Hallucinogen use was not frequent enough to cause disorder. It was more purposeful. One could also list sedative/hypnotic use disorder because he used either chloroform, etc., though sporadically. One wonders how similar either is to ketamine, if it's a dissociative, since either is not used at all anymore, since it's almost impossible to get, only chemists can get it. but ketamine is widely used now. Just a tangent. Primary, of course, is heroin and cocaine. Neurocognitive effects. By the 1940s, he may have had a mild substance-induced neurocognitive disorder. His memory and concentration suffered some decline, possibly from years of drug use and perhaps minor strokes. Speculation, as he had high blood pressure, likely from years of stimulants. There's anecdotal mention of him repeating stories or forgetting who he told what, which could be age or substance-related brain changes. Differential. Some might wonder about delusional disorder, grandiose type, but his delusions were part of broader personality and mood context, not isolated. Also consider sexual paraphilic disorders. Crowley clearly had paraphilias, sadism, voyeuristic elements, perhaps transvestic fetishism in his cross-dressing rituals, etc. He made others perform bestiality, but did he engage? He attempted with a goat via partner, that's a paraphilia, zoophilia, interest. Sexual, inexcusable, evil. In a real sense. If diagnosing in modern terms, yes, I'd list sexual sadism disorder, possibly sexual masochism disorder too, given he sought being flogged in some rituals, though that seemed more situational and not causing him clinical distress, except that he integrated it into his spiritual context. In any case, paraphilias were present, but they were egosyntonic for him. He didn't see them as disorders, but from a clinical viewpoint, they did contribute to harm. Summing up primary diagnoses. Narcissistic personality disorder, grandiose type with antisocial features. DSM-V would allow both diagnoses, or in ICD-11, we might say mixed personality disorder, predominantly narcissistic and dissocial. This captures the core persistent personality structure. Other specified trauma and stressor-related disorder, complex PTSD. If one acknowledges the developmental trauma effects behind the personality disorder, some clinicians might fold this into personality disorder understanding, but highlighting it is useful to explaining his rage and relationship instability. Bipolar I disorder, most recent episode depressed, given he had at least one period that could be construed as mania with psychotic features, e.g. the Cefalù madness, or at least bipolar II if one believes it never went full manic. This addresses mood cycling independent of personality, though they interact. Severe opioid use disorder, heroin addiction, and severe stimulant use disorder, cocaine. With physiological dependence in sustained remission only upon death. He never truly quit. Addicts really don't, usually. Sedative/hypnotic use disorder, either and chloral, I guess that's chloroform, potentially, possibly mild. Stimulant-induced psychotic disorder, at times when on cocaine. Possibly minor episodes. Sexual sadism disorder. Given non-consensual elements at times, if all had been consensual BDSM, we might not pathologize, but he crossed lines. Other specified paraphilic disorder, multiple concomitant paraphilias, including coprophilia and fetishistic elements. We can add tobacco use disorder, he smoked a lot, and caffeine use disorder, he drank absurd amounts of coffee. Oh, I probably have that one. Lesser issues, but notable in records. I'm much better than I used to be. Exclusions. Not schizophrenia, not autism as primary, not ADHD, though he had focus issues. He could also superfocus, and ADHD doesn't account for his interpersonal profile. One interesting possibility. Histrionic personality disorder aspects. Flamboyance, needing to be center of attention, provocative behavior. He did have some histrionic flair, love of drama, costumes, shocking statements. But histrionic personality disorder typically coquettes to gain approval. Crowley more bulldozed for power, so it's secondary. Psychoanalytic summary. Crowley's personality is best seen as a fixation at a narcissistic stage of development complicated by trauma. Using classical terms, probably issues at oral stage due to early loss, fueling dependency and substance issues, and phallic stage, Oedipal battles fueling grandiosity and sexual compulsion. His ego ideal, internal idealized image, was enormous, the beast, the magus, and his real self could never live up to it, causing constant tension and need for external validation. His superego, his internal critic and conscience, was split. Part turned into a punitive voice of his mother, which he rebelled against by sinning boldly to drown it out. Part he reshaped into Thelemic philosophy that justified him. So his conscience was not absence, but redefined such that traditional morality was null and his own law was righteous, convenient, but also leaving him at moral drift sometimes, to put it lightly. Spiritual versus psychopathology distinction. A crucial differential is between genuine mystic insight and psychotic delusion. Crowley certainly had altered states that in isolation might look like hallucinations, i.e. voices of Aiwass or visions of gods. However, context matters. He deliberately induced these via practices akin to shamanic vision questing. In transpersonal psychology, one could argue these were non-ordinary states of consciousness that do not indicate mental illness per se. Indeed, Crowley functioned quite well in ordinary life tasks soon after many visions. This is the benefit of the Western magical tradition. It allows you to compartmentalize like that if you do it right. The content of his visions was exotic, but often internally consistent and meaningful, not word salad or truly disorganized. So I would not give a primary psychotic disorder diagnosis. No schizoaffective either, since mood episodes explain his rare psychotic-like periods better, and he didn't have continuous psychosis. Instead, I'd note, subject exhibits persistent occult/spiritual beliefs and claimed perceptual experiences that are culturally contextualized within his practice of ceremonial magic. These are not acute hallucinations, but part of an organized belief system, and thus are not diagnosed as psychotic disorder. This is akin to saying his visions are part of his religion, albeit a personal religion, so clinically we treat them as belief rather than involuntary pathology, which of course I and probably all of you agree with. Especially if you've had an actual experience of magic, which is a set of techniques for turning those visions on and off. Among many other things. Risk assessment. Historically, Crowley was a risk to others psychologically. Some followers arguably had their lives ruined. Physically, he rarely assaulted anyone violently, except dueling one opponent or so. He was a risk to himself primarily via substances. If he were a contemporary patient, the biggest management issues would be treating addiction, perhaps methadone for heroin, etc., or Suboxone. Mood stabilization, a mood stabilizer like lithium or valproate could help his volatility. Valproate, I don't know how it's pronounced. And long-term psychotherapy focusing on trauma and personality restructuring, though narcissists notoriously resist therapy, he might engage intellectually. Prognosis if treated. Considering he died still an addict and narcissist without formal treatment, one might say poor if untreated. If hypothetically he had insight and accepted midlife help, perhaps he could have moderated some behaviors. We saw a hint when he cooperated with a doctor to manage heroin in the 40s. But given the era and his personality, he was essentially untreatable in life. He had to be the therapist of himself via magic, which only partially succeeded. Let this be a warning to us all. We have much better tools now. You don't have to do it all yourself and self-medicate. Conclusive clinical assessment, and seeking help is okay. All right. Conclusive clinical, and probably a good idea at times, conclusive clinical assessment, principal personality diagnosis, narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial and borderline traits, malignant narcissism. Contributing developmental factors, early religious trauma, possible sexual victimization, probable, and loss of father leading to pathological narcissistic defense. Principal axis 1 diagnoses, bipolar disorder, type 2 likely, severe opioid and cocaine use disorders. Other axis 1, paraphilic disorders, sexual sadism, etc. Possible stimulant-induced psychosis episodes, short-lived paranoia on cocaine. Medical conditions, chronic asthma, which led to opioid use, substance-related organ damage, he had chronic bronchitis from heroin smoking, and possible liver damage. And I will also add to this, it hasn't been fully documented, but probably the effects of quite a lot of venereal diseases. Psychosocial stressors, infamy and public shaming, financial stress, war, World War I and II causing displacement. Yeah, pretty stressful, those two world wars. Interpersonal loss. Conclusion. Aleister Crowley can be best understood clinically as a highly intelligent, trauma-scarred individual with a severe personality disorder, narcissistic/psychopathic, and mood dysregulation. Whose life trajectory was further complicated by heavy substance addiction and unorthodox belief systems. His case demonstrates how extreme genius and extreme pathology coexisted. His creativity and insight were not erased by his disorders, but the latter prevented healthier expression and interpersonal harmony. In a modern context, he likely would attract multiple diagnoses, but the interplay, narcissism fueling drug abuse, trauma fueling narcissism, etc., that's an interesting cycle, means one must treat the whole person, not just discrete diagnoses. All right, next up is psychoanalytical commentary, where we look from Freud, Jung, and Reich. But let's do super chats. I see at least one in. Thank you again, Charles. Another from Elizabeth. Thank you so much for the super chat. She is our, by the way, we have leaderboards for right now. I think they reset for every video, but Elizabeth is currently fan number 3. Or top, you have taken the bronze in today's race. What's your take on using substances or plant medicine in ritual, and where do you think Crowley used them appropriately or misused them in his own practice? Okay. Now, first of all, I do not condone the use of illegal substances. And the techniques that I teach, yoga, ceremonial, magic, allow you to have all of these experiences without them. They are not necessary. However, I would simply be ahistorical if I said that they don't, and disingenuous if I said that substances don't play a role in this type of work. And have since the times of Paleolithic shamanism. I think that if you're going to do that, you should have fully mastered, you should have magic down pat first. Because otherwise, and by that, I mean, you should be able to do open magical spaces using pentagram rituals. You should be able to pick astral layers to scry. You should be able to induce visions of God, spirits, or you should be able to induce experiences. People experience these things differently. Sober. Because otherwise, if you use drugs, you'll never know whether it was just the drug or not. And one of the things that I'm very grateful for is that I was into magic way before I ever touched, for instance, psilocybin mushrooms or something like that. And because of that, I think that, magic is much more ingrained in me and not just a drug trip. In terms of where Crowley used them appropriately, well, he was a great experimenter. I think that his use, he wrote an article called The Psychology of Hashish, where he talks about using cannabis indica for ritual. I think that's a pretty, unless you overdo it, I think that's a pretty benign use. And I think it's actually quite productive for magical work. So there's that. In terms of misuse, I mean, we just read his whole chemical profile. So one of the worst misuses, I think, is ether. Crowley, liked to huff ether, and also some of the OTO groups like Solar Lodge took that practice on in the 60s. Bizarre, like this said that his nose was eaten away by cocaine, giving him that nasal, whiny voice, all this stuff. So I think that's kind of my answer. You don't want to be dependent on them. If you find yourself dependent on substances, either physically, which is usually is the rarest and happens, but it happens, obviously. Psychologically, meaning you're using them as a crutch. For instance, if you find yourself having to use drugs before socializing, going to work, or fulfilling other basic human functions, you have a problem. And of course, if you need substances to do magic or to do ritual work, you have a problem. Now you're dependent on something. That's kind of my quick checklist. All right. Any other super chats? Thank you again, Elizabeth. All right. Psychoanalytic commentary. From a psychoanalytic and broader depth psychology perspective, Aleister Crowley's psyche offers a rich tapestry of archetypal forces, unconscious conflicts, and defense mechanisms. In this commentary, we will interpret Crowley's life and behavior through various psychodynamic lenses, Freudian, Jungian, and Reichian, tying these theories back to concrete events and patterns already discussed. This allows a more symbolic and structural understanding of why Crowley was the way he was. Freudian/classical analysis. Freud might start with Crowley's childhood and point out an unresolved Oedipus complex. Crowley's adoration of his father and rivalry/hatred with his mother is textbook Oedipal. When his father died prematurely, the Oedipal conflict ended tragically. The loved father was lost, leaving the boy with guilt. Did unconscious aggressive wishes of the beast kill the father? An unconscious belief possible in children and with an overwhelming mother. Crowley's mother calling him the beast could be seen as projecting her own anger as a rejected wife/widow onto him, branding him as the paternal enemy, the beast of Revelation being Satan, arguably a father figure rival to God. The result, Crowley internalized a split image of self, part striving to be like the father, preacher, holy strong, and part identifying with the mother's assigned role of devil child. This is a recipe for neurosis, a divided self-concept. Crowley resolved this by flipping it into a grandiose identity. If I am to be the beast, I will make it a noble, heroic role, not a shameful one. That's a classic example of the defense mechanism of identification with the aggressor, as mentioned before, and also reaction formation, taking what was meant to be an insult or sign of badness and turning it into a proud identity, a form of overcompensation. Freud would also focus on Crowley's sexuality as polymorphously perverse, essentially not restrained by the usual latency or genital phase consolidations. Crowley's early suppression of masturbation by caregivers meant his normal sexual development was stunted. He didn't get to integrate sexuality healthily. It was kept infantile and dirty. When he finally exploded into sexual activity at adolescence, it came out in perverse forms, S&M fantasies, multiple partners, etc. Consistent with Freud's notion that repressed libido returns with neurotic distortions. His overt atheism and blasphemy were also Freud's view of religion in reverse. Freud said religion is an illusion to cope with fear. Crowley made irreligion, blasphemy, his coping mechanism to defy his fears, fear of sin/hell taught in youth. In analytic terms, Crowley's conscious ego, allied with his id instincts against a punitive superego introjected from his mother/church. Instead of a balanced ego mediating, his ego essentially said, I'm on the id's side. Superego, Christian morals must be destroyed. This created a moral inversion. It allowed instinctual gratification, sex aggression, but at cost of social alienation and deeper conflict, since the superego, mother's voice, still existed, and he had to constantly fight it by escalating transgressions. I want blasphemy, murder, etc., as he said. Is like telling the superego, see, I'll do the worst and I don't care. That fight consumed his psychic energy. Freud would also likely diagnose Crowley with a narcissistic neurosis, meaning unable to love others, object libido turned inward as self-love. Indeed, Crowley said, I was never very attached to my children or wives. My work was my love. He, in essence, admitted to being unable to form normal object attachments, which Freud would tie to either a strong primary narcissism or a trauma in object relations, loss of father, betrayal by mentors. Crowley's grandiosity could be seen as a compensatory ego inflation to mask deep-seated feelings of inadequacy or unlovability. The small boy who lost his father and felt cast as villain by his mother. There's a hint of this vulnerability. Crowley occasionally wrote self-pitying lines in private, like no one truly understands or loves me. Paraphrased from Confessions. That's the narcissistic wound laid bare. Freud's structural theory might note Crowley's id was extremely strong, sexual and aggressive drives unchained. His superego was partly rejected, but likely still harsh unconsciously, evidenced by times he punished himself via extreme drug binges or masochistic rituals. That could be seen as superego-driven subconscious self-punishment for guilt, and his ego struggled to find coherence, hence so many delusions and rationalizations as ego defenses. Classic ego defenses in Crowley. Rationalization, every vice had a spiritual rationale. Projection, accusing others of the malice he himself held, e.g. calling former friends evil black magicians when he was doing baneful magic. Denial, denying addiction's hold on him for years, and sublimation, channeling sexual energy into poetry and ritual in somewhat refined form. Freud might also appreciate Crowley's version of psychoanalysis. He did practice a form of self-analysis in his magical diaries, noting down feelings and fantasies. But lacking a neutral analyst, he often just confirmed his biases. Jungian analysis. Jung would likely see Crowley as someone enthralled to archetypal forces. The most dominant archetype in Crowley's psyche was the shadow, the rejected dark aspects. Crowley famously said one must integrate the shadow to achieve wholeness. And he took that to mean acting out all forbidden impulses, a misinterpretation, perhaps of Jung's meaning, which was more about acknowledging not being possessed by the shadow. Crowley let the shadow ride him. By identifying as the beast, the culturally defined shadow of Christianity, he surrendered to it rather than balanced it with light. Another key archetype was the self or God image. Crowley's holy guardian angel quest can be read as pursuit of the self, the integrated divine core. He did achieve some moments of union in 1906 and 1921. He had visions of the solar disk of consciousness, which sound like self-realization glimpses. But Jung would observe that Crowley then did not properly relativize his ego. Instead of recognizing his ego as part of self, he conflated ego with self, with capital S self, the inflation issue. He thought, I am the chosen prophet, self. That's classic inflation. The ego claims the numinous as its own. Jung warned that identifying with an archetype can cause mania or psychosis. Crowley's case exemplifies this. Identifying with the Beast 666 archetype gave him strength, but also made him arrogant and eventually isolated. Jung would also highlight Crowley's relationship with the anima, inner feminine. Crowley had many anima projections. Each Scarlet Woman carried an aspect of his anima, and he engaged them to contact the unconscious. But his anima was evidently split. He adored the idea of a magical muse woman, but also despised ordinary womanhood, misogyny. This suggests his anima was in negative form often. He had nightmares of the devouring mother, perhaps unconsciously fueling his distrust of women. He sought to consciously invoke goddesses, Babylon, Isis, etc., trying to align with a positive anima figure, but because his personal mother complex was toxic, the relationships repeatedly soured. Jung might say he never truly integrated the anima. He externalized it, used women as conduits, then blamed them for flaws rather than realizing the issue was in his projection. Only at the end, possibly, with how he treated some female students kindly by correspondence, did he show a gentler anima influence. Okay, we're coming into the home stretch here. Give me 2 seconds. I need some water. I'll be back. All right. Continuing with Jungian analysis. Archetypally, Crowley lived out the magician archetype in both its light and dark forms. The wise sage and the trickster. He had genuine wisdom at times, like insights into comparative religion that were profound, but also the trickster, con man, playing pranks like fake suicides, enjoying hoaxes. The magician archetype often is detached from normal ethics, focusing on knowledge and power. Crowley personifies that. A Jungian might further interpret his visions as encounters with autonomous complexes or archetypal images. His guardian Aiwass could be an animus projection through Rose, or a manifestation of the wise old man archetype guiding him. Choronzon, the demon of chaos he evoked, is clearly a shadow archetype or even the trauma complex, all the chaos within him given a name. He ritualistically conquered Choronzon in 1909, perhaps a partial integration attempt, but notably, he used another person, Neuberg, to triangulate that battle, which suggests he couldn't face that inner chaos alone and needed a scapegoat or companion. Neuberg took on the role of his psychological container and got psychologically damaged from it, as Neuberg reportedly had a breakdown later, a sort of enmeshment and projective identification possibly at play. I recommend the book The Magical Dilemma of Victor Neuberg by Jean Overton Fuller, a great book. Jung would absolutely comment on Crowley's lack of individuation. Instead of mellowing into a balanced psyche in midlife, Crowley fell prey to more extreme imbalances. The midlife crisis around 45, when the Abbey collapsed, that's when many go through individuation, but he doubled down on his persona rather than integrate the opposite. Jung might chalk it up to not having a genuine mirror, an analyst or true friend, to confront him with his shadow. His followers either feared or idolized him, so he never got the confrontation needed to humble himself and grow. Only life itself confronted him via failure and aging, which might have done some work, but too late to fully individuate. I'm going to skip over the Reichian stuff again. Trauma and inner child. Modern trauma-informed analysis, like Janina Fisher or structural disassociation theory, okay, here we go, real psychology, not reg, might suggest Crowley had disassociated ego states, a wounded child part who felt unloved and frightened, buried deep in a harsh, punitive parent introject, his mother's voice calling him beastly, and a strategic manager part, which became his grandiose persona to ensure no one could hurt him again. Whenever the wounded child feelings approached consciousness, e.g. after Rose left him or a friend betrayed him, likely his punitive part and manager part kicked in, the punitive part scolding him or others as weak, stupid, and the manager reasserting dominance, I don't need them, I'm the beast. So he rarely, if ever, felt the pure grief or vulnerability, maybe only in some drug haze or rare dream. Thus, he presents as an adult whose true self, the original vulnerable self, is exiled, and a protector self, the beast identity, runs the show. That model resonates with how extremely defensive he was to any ego slight, a protector overreacting to defend a very fragile exiled self. Mythological framing. One can also liken Crowley to mythic patterns. He clearly identified with Lucifer, the light bringer who rebelled against God. Psychologically, Lucifer is the archetype of proud intellect and defiance. Crowley epitomized that with all the beauty, brilliance, and tragedy, fall from grace, that myth entails. Another myth he resonated with was Faust, the man who sells his soul for knowledge and pleasure. Crowley somewhat sold his by sacrificing conventional happiness, like family and stability, in pursuit of occult knowledge. At the end of Faust, Faust is redeemed by divine grace. At the end of Crowley's life, did he find any grace? Hard to say, likely not overtly. In a sense, his lack of resolution is what makes him a poignant figure. It's an unresolved myth, more an Icarus who flew too high and crashed. In conclusion, psychoanalytically, Crowley's case illustrates the catastrophic result of enormous primal energies, libido and aggression, untempered by a sufficiently developed capacity for love and grounded identity. He tried to play magician-therapist to himself via magic and did achieve occasional insight, like acknowledging everyone has a child inside, as he noted in one essay, unusual for his time. But his narcissism resisted truly surrendering to a transformative process that required humility. Israel Regardie once quipped, had he had a good analysis, Crowley might have been a kinder prophet. Instead, Crowley remained an amalgam of illuminated guru and wounded child, using the former to shield the latter. His life's psychoanalytic lesson might be integration. This goes with one of the earlier super chats, which is what's the best takeaway we can take from Crowley. His life's psychoanalytic lesson might be integration. The very alchemical gold he sought demands more than intellectual or ritual pyrotechnics. It requires genuine emotional confrontation with one's vulnerability and capacity for love. Crowley glimpsed this truth, but tragically never fully lived it. Conclusion. Do we have any super chats? Thank you, Tyler, so much. And Maria, lovely to see you back here. I was just informed by Frauder RC of David Jones passing. I'm very, very sorry to hear that, and I hope you're doing as well as as one might imagine. So I was very sad to hear that. Conclusion. Aleister Crowley stands out in modern history as a figure where genius and psychopathology were inextricably intertwined. In this exhaustive profile, we have dissected Crowley's psyche from multiple angles, diagnosing his likely mental health conditions, tracing developmental roots and trauma, evaluating the psychological role of his magic and mysticism, examining his extraordinary intellect and creativity alongside his self-destructive tendencies, and following the evolution of his personality through the dramatic stages of his life. Key findings. Crowley's psyche was dominated by a severe narcissistic personality structure, manifesting in grandiosity, entitlement, manipulativeness, and an impoverished capacity for empathy. This narcissism was not merely an obnoxious trait, but the core around which he organized his life story, casting himself as prophet, genius, and great beast in a personal mythology that justified and perpetuated his behavior. Underneath this, however, lay layers of unresolved trauma and emotional turmoil, a wounded child who lost a beloved father and endured a punitive mother, a teenager sexually traumatized and shamed, and a young man who coped with inner pain by rebelling against all moral constraints. These early wounds set the stage for a lifelong pattern of disassociation and compensation. Crowley disassociated from vulnerability and instead over-identified with an omnipotent persona, compensating for feelings of unworthiness with extreme grandiosity. We identified numerous mental health diagnoses applicable to Crowley, chief among them narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features, bipolar mood disorder, and polysubstance addictions. Crowley's case illustrates how these conditions can feed into each other. His manic/hypomanic phases amplified his grandiosity and risk-taking, while depressive crashes exacerbated by drug withdrawal or failure of grand schemes further drove him to substance use and magical delusions to avoid facing reality. The result was a self-reinforcing cycle of dysfunction. For instance, when the Abbey of Thelema collapsed amid scandal, instead of humbly reassessing, Crowley doubled down on drug use and wrote an autobiography singing his own praises, a narcissistic coping strategy to shore up a fracturing ego. Throughout our analysis, a constant theme was the tension between Crowley's creative and spiritual genius and his pathological impulses. On one side, we see a man of encyclopedic knowledge, profound experiential insight into mystical states, and original contributions to occult philosophy, like the principle of true will, that have influenced generations, including myself and probably everyone on this chat. He demonstrated legitimate intellectual brilliance and an ability to synthesize Eastern and Western esoteric concepts well ahead of his time. On the other side, we confront the reality that Crowley's personal life was marked by exploitation, cruelty, and chaos. He routinely harmed those close to him, emotionally, financially, sometimes physically or morally, and was seemingly blind to the damage or even perversely proud of it. His sexual proclivities, unfettered by empathy or convention, led him to behavior that by any standard is considered abusive. Coercion of partners into degrading acts, possible underage encounters, etc., reflecting paraphilic disorders and a collapsed boundary between consent and harm in his pursuit of magical experiences. One must ask, was Crowley mad, or was he bad, or was he something else entirely, a visionary? The evidence suggests he was some of each. Psychiatrically mad in the sense that he entertained delusions, believing objectively in his messianic status and in literal interpretations of his magical communications, and engaged in self-defeating impulsive behavior, destroying his health and relationships. He had episodes of paranoia, especially coke-induced, where he truly believed in elaborate psychic attacks and conspiracies against him. He showed patterns of dissociation, speaking as different personas, writing in third person, etc., indicating an unstable, cohesive self. In modern terms, his personality organization could be considered at the borderline/narcissistic level, not psychotic in baseline reality testing, but subject to transient psychotic episodes under stress, e.g., his most extreme magical visions or rage episodes might qualify. morally bad or more neutrally antisocial, in that he consistently violated norms of humane conduct. He lied, cheated, manipulated. He reveled in blasphemy and perversity, not just privately, but in ways that hurt others, like encouraging drug use in disciples who then suffered addiction. Yeah, this is why I say don't do it, right? You can do all of this stuff without drugs, and you'll have a much longer career in it. He took very little responsibility for others' well-being and, in fact, rationalized harm as a form of occult training or spiritual liberation. This really happens sometimes with guru figures. Andrew Cohen is a recent example. Chogyam Trungpa, Adi Da. They rationalize their abuse of their followers as crazy wisdom. This speaks to a profound empathy deficit and perhaps a sadistic streak, elements of psychopathy. As one biographer put it, if one tallies Crowley's behaviors against Hare's psychopathy checklist, he scores alarmingly high. While he was not a conventional criminal, his conscience seemingly selectively absent. While he was not a conventional criminal, his conscience seemed selectively absent. He professed a radical individualist ethics, do what thou wilt, that conveniently aligned with his impulses, and he rarely blinked at collateral damage unless it threatened his own interests. Visionary genius, in that he genuinely pushed boundaries of consciousness and articulated a spiritual framework, Thelema, that, while extreme, contains original and compelling ideas. Crowley's emphasis on individual will and personal, direct experience of the divine was arguably a precursor to later humanistic and transpersonal psychology, emphasizing self-actualization and peak experiences. He demonstrated creative originality in fields from poetry to mysticism. Even his detractors often concede there was a method to his madness. For example, his once ridiculed integration of yoga with Western magic is now common and brilliant in holistic spiritual practices. That wasn't just Crowley, it was Alan Bennett as well. He also had moments of what could be called philosophical lucidity, e.g. his discussion on the relativity of moral codes, or his recognition that the unconscious plays a role in magical visions, insights aligned with emerging psychology of his time. Thus, the ultimate portrait that emerges is of a deeply divided human being. Crowley held extraordinary capacities, intellectual, imaginative, and to some extent spiritual. Yet these coexisted with profound psychological disturbances and character flaws that he never resolved. It's as if he was several selves at war, the enlightened sage versus the indulgent demon, the brilliant scholar versus the petulant child, the seeker of God versus the slave of his own vice. Significantly, our study indicates that Crowley's mystical and magical pursuits were both a product of and a refuge from his psychopathology. They were a product of it in that his grandiose delusions found a canvas in occultism. It gave structure to his megalomania, e.g. claiming supernatural attainment to justify feeling special. His rituals sometimes served to enact internal dramas rather than purely to achieve transcendence. For example, battling Karanzan might have been externalizing an inner breakdown. At times, one can argue he used magic as a defense mechanism, a way to impose order and meaning on inner chaos, to feel in control when life was otherwise uncontrollable. Yet magic was also a refuge and container. It allowed Crowley to sublimate many of his issues into a grand quest rather than, say, descending into aimless delinquency or overt insanity. For instance, rather than an anonymous sadist harming people in secret, he made sadomasochism part of sacred rituals, giving them context and arguably some consensual boundaries. Most of his inner circle were willing adults who chose to play his games, albeit under charismatic sway. His Thelemic creed arguably kept him from complete self-destruction at times. It provided a narrative of purpose that buoyed him in his darkest attic days. He often said the work must continue. That kept him writing through poverty. It is Crowley's persistence in the face of complete... It's almost like he knew he was writing for hundreds of years in the future. His persistence in writing and publishing in the face of complete destitution and being ignored and ridiculed by the mainstream is commendable. One might say the very ambition to be a great beast kept him alive, where a less imaginative person might have succumbed to overdose or suicide given the same stressors. That's interesting. So basically what they're saying here is the imagination can save you. Like a creative contextualizing imagination of your situation, or imaginative framing can save you from despair and deaths of despair. In the end, however, the pathology overtook the genius more often than not. Crowley died addicted, physically ill, and largely alone, still clinging to magical rationalizations. For example, per witnesses performing a small ritual or uttering a spell with his last breaths. He never recanted his belief in his exceptional destiny. Well, he died in 1947, and here we are all talking about him. Indeed, it likely would have shattered him to confront that fully. From a clinical viewpoint, this shows the rigidity of his narcissistic defense. It persisted even as reality battered it down. As Colin Wilson observed, Crowley couldn't abandon the Messiah mask on his deathbed because to do so would be psychological suicide. This indicates that the grandiose persona had become so fused with his identity that letting it go meant facing an inner emptiness he was never equipped to handle, the void left from childhood of not feeling truly loved for himself. Yeah, put that next to... He might have mastered Thoth and Buddhism, but could he master that void? Implications. Understanding Crowley psychologically does more than explain one man's life. It offers insight into the interplay of trauma, personality, and spirituality. Okay, now we're talking. Crowley can be seen as an extreme case of a pattern not uncommon in leaders of new religious or spiritual movements, a charismatic visionary with significant narcissism and inner demons, whose personal failings often undermine or distort the very message they bring. It prompts crucial questions about how much one can separate the value of a teaching from the flaws of the teacher. In Crowley's case, devotees have tended to separate them, saying things like, quote, Crowley's system is great even if he was flawed. Whereas skeptics dismiss the whole thing because of his deviance. A balanced view might be that Crowley's psychological pathologies colored everything he did, sometimes negatively, as in the hurt caused to individuals and the disrepute that hindered serious study of his ideas, but sometimes oddly positively. His uninhibited contrarian mind broke through Victorian constraints to receive esoteric wisdom that a more normal psyche might never have uncovered. As a result, studying Crowley is of interest not just to occult historians, but to psychologists. He is a case study in how brilliance and deviance can coexist and feed on each other. For the field of mental health, Crowley's life underscores the importance of early intervention in childhood trauma and personality development. One can speculate that had young Aleister received proper support after his father's death and not been subjected to religious terror and sexual abuse, he might have channeled his intelligence into more constructive channels, perhaps becoming an academic Orientalist or a poet who didn't need to be wickedest man to make a mark. Well, on the other hand, how boring is that? His life also highlights how substance abuse can exacerbate underlying disorders, pulling a person into a deeper spiral. A cautionary tale is relevant now as then. Yeah, I mean, it's like, can anybody now look at people like these like famous heroin addicts like Crowley or William Burroughs as somehow brave or deviant when we have an opioid crisis completely eating America from the inside out? I don't think there's anyone in America, I don't know about other countries, but I don't think there's anyone in America that somehow the opioid crisis and the tragedy of it has not touched. I've lost multiple friends to heroin. And many people have lost family members or are dealing with a family member that's an addict. There's nothing glamorous about heroin at all. It just eats people. And not just people, but it only brings suffering to everyone around them. So I think that the age of considering, this Crowley or Burroughs or Baudelaire or any of these people as brave explorers because they took drugs, it's like, yeah, it's like, and it's like, you can get that from anyone. Ay. From a psycho-spiritual lens, Crowley's story is a caution that spiritual attainment without psychological integration is precarious. Crowley achieved altered states that many mystics strive for, but they did not save him from pettiness, addiction, or interpersonal failure. I reserve the right to pettiness at all times. In fact, they sometimes inflated his ego. This suggests that psychological shadow work and cultivation of compassion are as vital to true enlightenment as any mystical vision, a lesson echoed by many later spiritual teachers who took note of Crowley's excesses. In closing, Aleister Crowley was neither simply a sage to be revered, nor a lunatic to be dismissed. He was a complex human with extraordinary gifts and deep flaws. His psychology was multiplex and many-sided, to use a phrase Crowley applied to himself in his Confessions. Approaching him with clinical objectivity, we can appreciate that many of the forces that drove him are universal human forces: desires for power, for recognition, for transcendence of suffering, but in him they were amplified to a dramatic degree. Studying how those forces played out in Crowley's psyche, we gain insight into both the heights and pitfalls of the human condition when pushed to its extremes. In the end, Aleister Crowley remains a diagnostically challenging, ethically troubling, yet intellectually fascinating figure. I think that's a good summation. Aleister Crowley remains a diagnostically challenging, ethically troubling, yet intellectually fascinating figure, one who perhaps best can be understood not in black and white terms, but in the full spectrum of his contradictions. He serves as a reminder that the line between visionary and madman is thin, often discernible only in the lasting fruits of one's life. Crowley's legacy in occult culture is undeniable. He helped revolutionize Western esoteric thought, but his personal legacy to those who knew him was largely destructive. For clinicians, he exemplifies the need to treat the whole person, mind, emotions, body, and spirit, because brilliance in one domain does not compensate for disorder in another. For spiritual seekers, he illustrates that enlightenment must encompass heart and soul, not just will and intellect, lest one become, in effect, one's own great beast, devouring the good from within. Ultimately, perhaps the most fitting clinical and moral conclusion about Crowley is one he ironically wrote of others. He had gigantic virtues and gigantic vices. His case teaches us the importance of striving to understand both, to neither excuse the vices because of the virtues, nor deny the virtues because of the vices. Instead, by understanding how Aleister Crowley became who he was, we glean a richer understanding of the fragile, formidable tapestry that is a human personality. Okay. Whew. There we have it. The end. I somehow managed to read the entire thing minus like a few paragraphs about Reiki and stuff. Amazing. Okay. Any more super chats? Join the Discord. Like and please, everyone, immediately subscribe to this channel if you're going to do one thing. It really helps. It really does. And, of course, join the Discord as well. All right. And that's it for me. We took about 6.5 hours total to read this, so bravo to everyone who stuck with it. And I hope that this has been fruitful, and I know it has been for me, both in assessing Crowley and, more importantly, thinking about the path of magic and what is healthy and what is not on it, what to emulate, what not to emulate, perhaps insights into your own process. So I think this has been quite useful. Occultology is saying super chats. Did you send another super chat? I see Tyler Van... Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, you did. See, what is it? It's like, you must have been mastering the occult secret of invisibility. This is so frequent now, and it's only you. I'm not trying to ignore you. You must have like done an invisibility spell or something. So I now see it. Thank you. Frauder RC sent 5 Magick.me gift memberships. Thank you so much. Always coming in strong. Occultology says, can you do a video about Frauder Akkad's tarot paths? Now that's an esoteric subject. Man, it would have to be more than just that. I'll definitely think about it. I'd really have to do some research on that too. I personally think that Frauder Akkad's reorganization of the Kabbalah is retarded. Sorry. I think that some of his stuff, like his 3D diagrams of the Kabbalah and his cosmic snowflake are gorgeous and wonderful. And I think Elira 31 is great, all that. But, rearranging the Kabbalah is a bit tarded. All right. Whew. Yeah, heroin is horrible. Heroin is horrible. That's something you don't understand maybe when you're young, and unless you have it in your family and you're reading about this. When you actually see what heroin does to people up close. I mean, cocaine is bad enough. It turns people into utterly self-obsessed assholes. But, heroin is a horrible, horrible, simply, it's just a source of human misery. That's all it is. That's all it is. It's just a source of human misery. All right, and with that, like and subscribe, hit the notifications bell, and we will be back soon for our regularly scheduled normal streams. Lots of love, everyone.